Among the Finno-Ugric peoples, early ideas about the soul reveal a deeply physical and almost tangible understanding of life itself. Death was not seen as a complete end, but rather as a gradual fading that remained tied to the body. As long as the bones endured, something of the person was believed to persist. This belief can be clearly seen in ritual practices, especially those involving animals such as bears. After a sacrifice, every bone was carefully preserved, because it was thought that life could somehow be restored if the structure of the body remained intact. The idea was simple, but powerful. Life clung to form, and destruction of the body meant the disappearance of the soul. This connection between body and soul also shaped how people dealt with danger and death. If a creature or person was considered harmful, destroying the body completely was seen as the only way to eliminate its presence entirely. In some traditions, even burial customs reflected this belief. Food was offered to the dead only for as long as the body remained recognizable. Once decay was complete, it was believed that the soul itself ceased to exist. In cases where the dead were feared, bodies might be burned, cut apart, or otherwise destroyed to prevent them from returning. Stories told of corpses that wandered at night, harming the living, but losing their power at sunrise. To stop such beings, people would pin them to the ground or pierce them, ensuring they could not rise again. At the same time, the soul was not thought of as a single, unified entity. Instead, it was believed to exist in multiple parts throughout the body. Each organ held its own vital force, with the heart, liver, and blood being especially important. Life was imagined as something that could move within the body, shifting from one part to another. This explains why a fatal wound was thought to occur only when the soul happened to be present in that exact spot at the moment of injury. Even a severe blow might not kill a person if the soul was elsewhere in the body at that instant. This belief extended into practices that may seem shocking today. Consuming parts of another being, especially the heart or liver, was thought to transfer strength and vital energy. By eating these organs, a person could absorb the courage or power of another. Blood, too, was seen as a carrier of life force, capable of passing qualities from one body to another. Even smaller parts of the body, such as hair or nails, were believed to contain fragments of the soul. This is why people were cautious about losing them, fearing they could be used to harm them through unseen means. Objects connected to a person were also believed to carry traces of their essence. Clothing, tools, or personal belongings could be used in magical practices, based on the idea that a part could represent the whole. This way of thinking shaped many rituals and beliefs about illness, where harm could come not directly to the body, but through something associated with it. Another important aspect of these beliefs was the idea of a second, more mobile soul, often described as a shadow or double. This shadow soul could leave the body during sleep, dreams, or moments of fear. When a person lost consciousness, it was said that their shadow had wandered away. Dreams were understood as real journeys taken by this wandering part of the self. If someone dreamed of distant places, it was believed their soul had truly travelled there. However, this separation was dangerous. If the soul failed to return, the person would fall ill or weaken. Because of this, waking someone suddenly was avoided, as it might prevent the soul from finding its way back. When illness struck, it was often explained as the loss or displacement of the soul. In such cases, a shaman or spiritual specialist would be called upon to retrieve it. These figures were believed to have the ability to travel between worlds, searching for lost souls and guiding them back to their bodies. In some stories, even those on the brink of death could recover if their soul returned in time. The bond between the physical body and the shadow soul remained strong even after death. The soul was thought to stay near the grave, continuing its existence alongside the remains. It did not fully separate from the body, but instead lingered in its presence. At the same time, another form of the soul, often described as breath, was believed to leave the body at the moment of death. This breath was seen as something like vapor, rising into the air and disappearing. Freed from the body, the soul could take on many forms. It might appear as a small animal, such as a mouse or a bat, or as a butterfly moving quietly through the night. These forms were not random, but reflected a belief that the soul was light, mobile, and capable of transformation. Encounters with such creatures were often interpreted as encounters with the souls of the living or the dead. In some cases, the soul could even take the shape of natural forces, such as wind or fire, moving unseen yet present in the world. Over time, these ideas developed into the concept of a companion spirit, a kind of double that existed alongside a person throughout their life. This presence could act as a protector, a guide, or even a warning sign. It might appear in dreams or be sensed in moments of danger. In some traditions, this spirit could outlive the person and continue to exist after death, sometimes appearing in familiar forms. The belief in souls was not limited to humans or animals. Everything in the world was thought to possess some form of life or spirit. The earth, water, fire, and even buildings were believed to have their own invisible essence. When this essence was present, things thrived. When it left, decay and misfortune followed. A home without its spirit became lifeless, just as a field without its soul could no longer produce crops. Even objects were thought to have a hidden, invisible side. This belief explains why items placed with the dead were often broken or damaged. By doing so, their physical form was destroyed, allowing their unseen essence to accompany the deceased into another realm. In this way, the world of the living and the world beyond were connected through these invisible forces. Names, too, were deeply connected to the idea of the soul. Giving a name was not just a social act, but a spiritual one. A name was believed to carry life, identity, and even the essence of ancestors. If a child became ill or weak, it was sometimes thought that the wrong name had been given. Changing the name could restore balance and health. In some traditions, it was believed that the spirit of a deceased relative could be reborn in a child, continuing the cycle of life through both name and soul. Among Finno-Ugric peoples, the customs surrounding death differed from region to region, yet they were bound together by a set of shared ideas. The living believed that the dead were beginning a difficult passage into another world, and for that reason every effort had to be made to prepare them properly for the road ahead. At the same time, death was not treated as harmless. The newly dead were often feared because it was thought that they might draw the living after them or return to the household they had just left. Funeral customs therefore served two purposes at once. They honoured the dead and protected the survivors. The moment life ended, the first concern was often to clear a path for the departing soul. In some places, openings in the roof were raised. In others, doors were thrown open, so that the soul could leave without delay. Sudden gusts of wind that arose near the dying were taken seriously, as though the air itself had begun to move with the passing of life. Certain peoples even believed that the death of a shaman stirred the natural world more violently, bringing storm and unrest with it. Death was not imagined as a silent break, but as an event that affected both the house and the landscape around it. Relatives gathered close to the body as soon as death occurred. They addressed the dead directly, asking forgiveness for harsh words, quarrels, or offences committed during life. This final exchange reveals how death did not immediately end the bond between the dead and the living. In some households, a bowl of water was placed by a window so that the departing soul might purify itself before continuing onward. Another custom found across several communities involved the killing of a hen at the moment of death or on the way to burial. The act was explained in different ways. Sometimes the bird was said to accompany the soul. Sometimes its blood was believed to shield the dead from danger. And sometimes it was treated as a substitute life offered at the threshold between worlds. Among some groups, the first drops of the hen's blood were even used to mark the face of the deceased. In other places, traces of the older sacrifice survived in altered forms, such as throwing a living hen onto the coffin so that the dead would not carry away the fortune of the household. Once these first rites were complete, attention turned to preparing the body. The dead had to be laid to rest quickly, but not carelessly. Washing the corpse was one of the earliest and most important duties, and although this custom was widespread far beyond Finno-Ugric societies, it took on special meanings within them. The person chosen to wash the body might be selected long beforehand. Details of the washing could matter deeply. In some areas, only the left hand was used. The state of the corpse itself was observed closely, as if the dead were still able to express approval or displeasure. A stiffened body or clenched fist might be taken as a sign that one of the attendants had offended the deceased in life. A relaxed body suggested acceptance. After washing, the corpse was dressed for a journey rather than merely prepared for burial. Clean clothing was essential, including fresh undergarments, head coverings, and wrappings for the feet. Men might be buried with hats, old men with staffs, women with headscarves, cloth, towels, jewellery, or sewing tools. A young unmarried woman could receive an especially rich burial outfit, because it was believed that in the next world marriage might still await her, and she should not arrive without a proper portion. Among northern groups, the dead were sometimes wrapped more simply in bark or animal skins. But even this simplicity carried the same meaning. The grave was not the end of movement. The dead were still travelling. For that reason, clothing alone was not enough. The dead also needed food, tools, and goods of all kinds. Weapons, knives, axes, fishing gear, skis, cooking vessels, spoons, and household items were placed in or around the grave. Women were given the implements of their daily work. Children received toys. A lame person might be buried with crutches, a hunter with his spear and even his dog, and a shaman with the objects connected to ritual power. Among the vulgar Finns, the tools used for making bast shoes were considered especially necessary, as though the road after death would demand the same practical labour as life on earth. Some objects were placed directly inside the coffin, while larger items were left beside the grave. In a few communities, the dead were even provided with rods so they might defend themselves in the next world against hounds, serpents, or hostile spirits. The dead were not only supplied for their own use, they could also become messengers to relatives who had died before them. Coins and goods were sometimes placed in the coffin, with the understanding that they would be delivered to kin already dwelling in the unseen world. Nuts or sweets might be tucked into a pocket, with words asking the deceased to greet the family dead and share gifts with their children. This reveals a view of the afterlife not as a distant abstraction, but as a continuation of social existence. The dead were expected to meet one another, speak, remember, and receive offerings just as the living did. One striking custom found again and again was the breaking of goods intended for burial. Valuable objects were smashed, spoons were broken, and household items were damaged before or during the funeral. This was not done carelessly. It reflected the belief that by destroying an object physically, its invisible counterpart could be released for use in the world beyond. At the same time, the act protected the household. Once the dead had received their share, no further claim should be made upon the inheritance of the living. A broken spoon or shattered possession marked a clear final division between the deceased and the family property left behind. Alongside all this care ran a strong current of fear. The dead were mourned, but they were also watched. Many people believed that the newly dead might wish to take companions with them. For that reason, protective acts began immediately. The eyes and mouth of the corpse were closed or covered, and in some areas, coins, stones, threads, or buttons were placed over the openings of the face. These measures were meant to stop the dead from seeing, calling, or sensing those who remained alive. In some communities, the body was shrouded completely, perhaps because as long as the corpse was intact, its soul was thought still to remain near it. Exposure created risk. Fear of contamination also shaped what happened in the house. A dying person might be removed from a proper bed and laid on straw. This may partly have reflected the idea that death polluted bedding, but it also expressed a practical separation between the world of daily comfort and the dangerous threshold of dying. Metal served widely as protection. Coins were dropped into water used for washing the corpse. Brass rings or other metal items were worn by those handling the dead. Certain tasks related to coffin making and grave digging could only be done by people whose households were free from pregnancy or nursing, since death was believed capable of harming fragile new life. While the corpse still remained in the village, ordinary routines were often suspended. Hunting, fishing, chopping wood, washing clothes, combing hair, heating the bathhouse, selling goods, receiving visitors, and even simple domestic work might be forbidden. The entire community, not only the household of the dead, entered a temporary state of caution. Everyone had to remain ready to assist the funeral if needed, but also to avoid any act that might invite misfortune. The dead had not yet fully left, and until burial was complete, life itself was thought to be unsettled. If the body remained overnight in the house, sleep was considered dangerous. People stayed awake beside the corpse, partly out of respect, partly because sleep left the soul vulnerable. A sleeping person, it was feared, might more easily have his soul taken by the dead. Noise was also discouraged. Some groups insisted that the room remain quiet so that any sign of the returning spirit could be noticed. Mirrors were turned to the wall or covered because reflective surfaces were thought capable of helping the dead seek out another companion among the living. In such details, the atmosphere of the wake becomes clear. Grief, vigilance, silence, and fear were all present together. Many funeral customs were designed to confuse the dead and keep them from returning home. In some northern traditions, the corpse was not taken out through the usual doorway at all, but through another opening in the tent or dwelling. Elsewhere, the dead were carried out through windows or through altered doorways so that the spirit would not easily find the path back. Some groups spun the coffin around several times before carrying it away, moving it against the direction of the sun. In other places, the tracks left by the funeral procession were swept away as soon as possible. Ashes, embers, salt, flour, heated stones, knives, axes or nails were placed where death had occurred or where the body had been washed. These were all barriers of one kind or another, intended either to cleanse the place or to prevent death from lingering there. After the body left the house, further measures followed. Furniture might be turned over. A nail could be driven into the spot where death had taken place or into the threshold crossed by the coffin. Some families abandoned a dwelling for a time after a death, especially in older nomadic settings, leaving the place marked but empty. More commonly, the house was purified through smoke, noise, or the striking of walls with branches. Fires were kept burning for several nights. Death was treated not simply as sorrow, but as a force that had to be driven out. The funeral procession itself was carefully ordered. Among some peoples, the corpse was placed in the last sled. Among others, the escort walked before the coffin rather than behind it. Looking back was forbidden, both during the procession and on the return. Those remaining in the village were sometimes forbidden to watch from windows, and windows might even be covered so that no one would symbolically follow the dead with their gaze. Such restrictions reveal how dangerous the path to the grave was believed to be. The dead had to be led away, but the living must not become attached to that direction. Once burial was complete, the danger was still not over. On the way back, footprints might be brushed away near the grave. Some people walked in circles around the burial mound before leaving, widening the distance between themselves and the dead. At the entrance to a tent or home, temporary gateways made from branches or poles could be set up, so that those returning from the grave passed through a final act of separation. Juniper or fir branches might be waved while commanding the dead to remain in their own place. A line could be cut across the path with an axe to form a boundary the spirit should not cross. Fire was again used for purification. People might leap over flames, rub their hands with ashes, or take a cleansing bath after returning. The goal was always the same. The funeral must end with the living fully restored to safety. Even the vehicle used for transport was treated with caution. A sled or cart that had carried the dead could not be put back into ordinary use at once. It might be left at the cemetery or allowed to stand unused for several days in the village street. Everything touched by death retained something of its danger. In some regions, a tree was cut down on the road back from the cemetery, leaving a high stump behind. This stump served as a kind of visual interruption, a sign meant to make the dead believe that home still lay far ahead, and that the road back was too long to follow. Halfway points between village and graveyard often became places of their own. Clothing worn by the deceased, the sponge or bark used in washing the body, shavings from the coffin, and other objects thought polluted by death were left there or hung in trees. These wayside places could become feared locations, marked by scraps of fabric, offerings, bones from later memorial sacrifices, or little posts with tables for food. In some communities, such places became substitutes for the grave itself in later rites, especially when someone had died far from home. The soul of the absent dead might be invited back symbolically to such a memorial place, so that remembrance could still occur near the village. Among Finnic peoples, trees along the road to the cemetery sometimes became lasting memorial markers. Their lower branches were cut away, crosses or initials were carved into the trunk, and boards bearing the name or year of death might be attached. These trees marked not only memory, but also a limit. The dead were remembered there, but also held at that point, as though the road between village and grave needed visible barriers against return. In some areas, cloth strips and bindings were left behind at these memorial trees, and shared drinking in honour of the dead took place there as well. Similar customs were known among Estonian communities, where a tree by the road might be cut, marked, or nailed for the same purpose. Some practices that later looked like simple mourning customs probably began as protective acts. For a period after a death, relatives might avoid going barefoot. Clothing could be worn inside out for weeks or months. Such behaviour seems less like personal grief in the modern sense, and more like ritual caution, a visible sign that the household remained under the shadow of death and had not yet fully returned to ordinary life. Among several Finno-Ugric communities, some funeral gestures that later came to be seen simply as signs of grief appeared to have begun as practical acts, meant to ease the dead on their passage out of the human world. One example can be found in the Votiac custom of leaving the belt ungirded for a fixed number of days after a death, the length of time depending on whether the deceased was a man or a woman. In some places this was explained by saying that the dead should feel lighter and less constrained. A similar idea appears elsewhere in northern ritual life, where knots, bands, and anything that binds the body could be avoided during moments of spiritual danger or transition. Women among Samoyedic and Ugrian groups also loosened their hair during burials, allowing it to hang freely. Such details suggest an older belief that the road to the next world should remain open and unobstructed, and that anything tied, fastened, or closed might hinder the soul's departure. Grief itself could be expressed in startlingly physical ways. Among the Votiacs, one of the strongest outward signs of sorrow was the tearing of hair and the scratching of the face until blood appeared. Relatives following the body to the grave wounded themselves as proof of genuine pain, and the bloodied hair could be cast onto the corpse as part of the farewell. Comparable acts were also known among the Mordvins. Mourning was not expected to remain inward or restrained. It had to be made visible on the body. The sorrow of the living became part of the burial itself, almost as if the dead needed to witness the depth of the loss before leaving. Public lament formed another part of this emotional world. In many communities, funeral grief was voiced through formal weeping, prolonged cries, and spoken or sung laments delivered beside the grave. Some regions even had women known for their skill in mourning, women who would come to graves and perform grief in a ritualized way. Among others, the role belonged not to hired mourners, but to the family itself. In either case, lament was not merely crying, it was a way of speaking to the dead, praising their life, recalling their deeds, and surrounding their departure with words that preserved honor. The dead were praised generously, their work admired, and their memory publicly enlarged in the very moment when they disappeared from ordinary life. Burial rites could also include unsettling attempts to discover who might die next. Once the coffin had been carried out into the yard, some Sherimus communities placed on it a bundle of threads of different lengths. Each participant drew one while speaking words that linked the length of the thread to the hope of a long life. The message was clear. The dead should go alone and not call another away too soon. Elsewhere, omens were sought in what remained after a death. Estonian households might examine the ashes left from the straw on which the dying person had lain, looking for marks that might reveal whether the next death on the farm would be human or animal. Finnish communities watched the horse drawing the hearse, paying attention to which foot moved first. Even such a small sign could be taken as a warning that another burial would soon follow. Among the Votiacs, this search for answers could become even more direct. The corpse itself was asked questions. Before burial, a rope was tied around the coffin near the place of the head, and one of those present would try to lift it while speaking to the deceased. Questions might concern the cause of death, the fate of the household, or the identity of the next person who would die. Names were called one by one, and the changing heaviness of the coffin was read as a response. What seems strange to a modern eye belonged to a world in which the dead were not silent at once. Their presence still lingered, and with the proper ritual, they might still reveal what lay ahead. Once the dead had been questioned, mourned, and escorted, attention turned to the place where they would continue their existence. The grave was not thought of as a mere hole in the earth. It was a dwelling. The coffin itself was often understood as a house for the dead, built carefully and addressed almost as though it were a gift offered to a living person. In Karelian and Volga Finnish tradition, a small opening was sometimes made on the side, a little window through which light could enter and through which the dead might in some sense remain aware of the world around them. The construction of the coffin could even be accompanied by spoken words asking the dead not to be offended if the house proved imperfect. The relationship between the living and the dead had not yet been severed. The family still owed the deceased respect, comfort, and a proper place to remain. When the body was lifted into this final house, Farewell speeches were addressed directly to the person who had died. The words spoken over the coffin often wished warmth, brightness, peace, and contentment in the next life. At the same time, another request was commonly included. Do not return in anger. Do not visit too soon. Do not take the living with you. Sometimes the dead were invited to appear only in dreams, where they might tell the family that life beyond the grave had become gentle and secure. In these farewell formulas, affection and fear stood side by side. The dead were loved, but they were also dangerous if they failed to settle among the other dead. Special tenderness appears in the rites for those who died unmarried. Parents and relatives could speak to a dead son or daughter as though the interrupted life would continue elsewhere. A young man who had not married in this world was urged to find a good wife beyond the grave. In some places, the burial of an unmarried youth took on the appearance of a wedding procession. The horses were decorated, bells were attached, and friends followed the dead as though escorting a bridegroom. A dead young woman might be buried with the clothing and ornaments needed for marriage, including the headgear associated with a married woman, so that she could take her place honourably in the world beyond. Such customs reveal a refusal to let death erase the unfinished hopes of life. Marriage, adulthood, and social dignity were imagined as still possible after burial. At the same time, the living tried to make sure that the dead did not carry away the well-being of the household. In some districts, a thread was pulled from the clothing of the deceased, or someone touched the coffin and spoke aloud, telling the dead not to take the house, the cattle, the seed, the luck, or the prosperity of the family. The dead must go, but the fortune of the living had to remain behind. A related custom among Eastern Votiacs involved tearing a white cloth into two pieces at the cemetery. One half stayed with the dead, while the other was taken back and hung inside the home for a year. The cloth expressed a divided relationship. The dead had departed, yet not entirely. A bond remained, but it had to be managed carefully, with one part left in the grave and the other preserved among the living. Among the Volga Finns and in some Votiac communities, a thread of the dead person's body length was laid from head to foot after the corpse had been covered with cloths. Sometimes 3 threads of different colours were used. These were said to serve as a path or support by which the dead could climb upward to the next realm. In some places, the thread was called a swing for the dead. A child might even be given a thread equal to the length of an adult, so that growth denied in earthly life could continue elsewhere. This was not a symbolic gesture in the modern sense. It reflected a literal vision of the next world as a place reached by movement, where the dead still required aid, measure, and equipment. Those who had watched beside the corpse through the night were expected to accompany it all the way to the grave. Along the road, people who met the procession wished the dead light, warmth, and a good existence. At the grave itself, the coffin might be lifted 3 times before being lowered, with words of reassurance spoken so that the dead would not fear the new dwelling. As the grave was filled in, relatives repeated wishes for peace and calm, and they asked the deceased not to frighten nearby people, but instead to guard the family, the home, and the herd from harm. In this way, the dead might become not only a danger, but also a protector if properly settled and respectfully addressed. The grave itself was not left completely sealed in imagination. In lament traditions from Karelia, the dead were pictured as still needing some tiny opening through which the soul could move. The final acts at the grave also reflected this continuing relationship. Earth was thrown in with words wishing that it rest lightly upon the dead. Small branches were fixed at the ends of the grave and threads were tied for the use of the deceased. For girls, kerchiefs could be fastened to poles or nearby trees. Candles with several branches were lit at the burial place, extending into the graveyard the same concern for warmth and light that had shaped the farewell speeches. The board coffin, however, seems to have been a later development in many areas. Among eastern Votiacs and Cheremis, the dwelling place of the dead was sometimes prepared only after reaching the graveyard. The dead were carried there fully dressed, in winter on a sled, and in summer on a cart, while a widow might ride or lie beside the body during the journey. At the cemetery, a shallow pit was dug and lined with branches or leaves. Strong boards were set along the sides and ends, and the dead was laid between them on its back. 2 more boards formed the roof, turning the burial into a small underground chamber. One side might even include a little window. In form and purpose, this was not very far from a tiny house. Among the northern Samoyeds and the most northern Ostiaks, older customs survived even longer. The dead were not always buried beneath the soil at all, but placed in structures built above ground. Ostiak and Vogel tombs of this kind resembled low wooden houses with sloping roofs made from bark and poles. Some included a window, just like a real dwelling. Lap traditions preserve similar structures in which the dead were laid on moss, hair, or other soft material. These burial houses make clear that the grave was not originally imagined as concealment under earth, but as continued residence in a special kind of shelter built for the dead alone. In Karelia, later practices still preserve traces of this older way. Even after burial in the ground had become common, little wooden house-like structures with roofs and windows were sometimes built above the grave. These no longer served as the actual resting place of the body, but they continued the memory of an earlier custom in which the dead truly lay within such constructions. Transitional forms could also be found, where a low grave was covered with boards and bark, rather than fully filled in. The long movement from house burial above ground to coffin burial below ground can be traced in such mixed forms. Archaeological remains from Finland point in the same direction. Ancient graves in Karelia have revealed wooden constructions fitted together with projecting corners like small buildings. Some even had board floors covered with skins. The dead were laid inside fully dressed and supplied with tools and goods, then covered with bark and roofed over with boards. Stones were placed above the structure once the grave had been closed. These were not simple burials, but carefully made residences for the dead, preserving in timber and earth the image of an inhabited house. Another old practice connected with the dead was burial in a boat or punt. This custom survived most clearly among Ugrian groups and Karelian Finns, and in some places the word for coffin still preserved the memory of the boat. Whether this reflects a belief that the dead must cross water to reach the next world, or simply that a boat was useful in the afterlife, the meaning remains the same at its core. The journey after death required equipment appropriate to the life once lived. In Russian Karelia, broken boats have even been found laid upside down over graves, suggesting that the vessel itself was offered to the dead after being symbolically ended in this world. As boats served as coffins for some peoples, sleds played a similar role for others. Lap communities were known to bury their dead in the same sled that had carried them, surrounding it with turf and tree stumps for protection against animals. Some accounts even describe the dead buried, seated in a sled, with a reindeer harnessed before it, as though the journey continued beyond the grave without interruption. The image is powerful and consistent with the wider Finno-Ugric view of death. The dead do not simply lie still. They depart, travel, and require the same means of movement that mattered in life. A very old form of coffin also appears across wide areas of the north, a hollowed tree trunk or wooden trough. Often, 2 split logs were used, the lower serving as the body of the coffin and the upper as the lid. Among Siberian peoples, such coffins were sometimes raised, above ground on supports. The shape recalls both the house and the boat, preserving something of each. It protected the body, but it also suggested motion, conveyance, and enclosure all at once. Language itself hints at the age of these burial ideas. In several Finno-Ugric languages, related words connect the ideas of corpse, grave, death, and the lingering presence or odour of death. Such connections suggest an ancient stage in which the dead person and the burial place were hardly separate concepts. The grave was where the body lay, and the body itself defined the place. This fits well with the idea that one of the oldest forms of burial may have been simply laying out the dead in a chosen place, without the more developed structures that appeared later. Cremation does not seem to have belonged, originally, to the older Finno-Ugric burial pattern, except perhaps in groups that had long contact with neighbouring peoples, for whom burning the dead was more familiar. Burned bones have been found in some Finnish graves, and there are reports of Estonians returning to older pre-Christian ways by exhuming and burning their dead. But among other Finno-Ugric peoples, burning appears mainly in exceptional situations, especially when the dead were believed dangerous. This suggests that cremation was less a standard rite than a special response, either borrowed from outside or used in moments of fear. Burial grounds themselves followed the structure of community life. Agricultural peoples usually buried their dead in set cemeteries, often enclosed or clearly marked. Sometimes one village had its own cemetery, while in other cases several villages shared a burial ground, inherited from an older parent settlement. Because villages often grew out of extended family groups, the cemetery too reflected kinship. It was not a neutral public space, but a resting place for a specific community and its descendants. Strangers were often excluded. Some Votiac groups even maintained separate places for travellers who died while passing through, burying them apart from the local dead. These graveyards were often located in sacred groves, especially among fir trees, and the dead continued to receive gifts there. Garments, cloths, and kerchiefs offered in memory of the deceased could be hung on branches rather than left to decay on the ground. Solitary graves might also be enclosed, perhaps to keep the dead from wandering. Among eastern Cheremis, a wooden cuckoo could be placed on a tall pole above the grave. The exact meaning of the bird was no longer remembered, but the custom suggests a symbolic language, once richer than later generations could explain. Similar bird figures appeared in other northern grave traditions as well. Whether special cemeteries go all the way back to the earliest Finno-Ugric period remains uncertain. Some traditions suggest a time when the dead were buried wherever death occurred, without permanent communal burial grounds. Lap practice points in that direction. In remote places and difficult seasons, the dead might be buried in forest or upland locations near the site of death, and only later, when winter made travel possible, moved to churchyards or more settled cemeteries. This flexibility belongs to a mobile world in which burial customs were shaped not only by belief but by climate, distance, and the rhythms of seasonal life. For many Finno-Ugric communities, burial was never the final act in the relationship between the living and the dead. Once a person had been laid in the grave with proper ceremony, that did not mean the obligations of the family had come to an end. The dead were still thought to need food, honour, remembrance, and careful treatment. If they were neglected, they might grow restless. A forgotten dead person could return, not always in visible form, but through sounds in the house, sudden disturbances, illness, or misfortune. In some traditions, the dead who came back to their former homes were remembered as strict former masters or mistresses of the household, people who in life had cared deeply about order, thrift, and discipline, and who after death still expected the family to do what was due to them. Because of this, memorial feasts held a central place in the world of the dead. Some were meant for all departed kin together, while others were arranged for one specific person. The older and more intimate form seems to have been the feast for an individual dead relative, someone whose memory was still fresh and whose presence was still believed to linger close to the home. The very first of these observances often took place on the day of burial itself, so the funeral meal and the first memorial feast were essentially one and the same. Food, drink, and praise belonged to the dead from the beginning, not only as an expression of grief, but as a practical necessity in managing the new relationship between the dead and those who remained alive. Among northern peoples, the earliest feast after burial could take on a forceful and almost ecstatic form. Drink was passed around, and before tasting it, the mourners might touch it with their fingers and mark themselves, joining the act of memory to the body itself. Once the gathering grew intense, the dead person would be praised in loud and vivid terms. He was remembered as strong, shrewd, skillful in the forest, capable in the home, wise in ritual matters, or powerful in whatever role had defined his life. Memory was not quiet. It was voiced publicly, repeated, celebrated, and fixed in the minds of those present. Some rites reached beyond food and drink to animal sacrifice. Among Lap groups, the reindeer that had drawn the dead person to burial could itself be killed a few days later in the dead person's honour. The meat was then consumed in company with relatives and dependents, but the treatment of the remains was careful and deliberate. The bones were gathered, enclosed, and buried, and a carved image connected with the deceased might be placed above them. Blood-marked rods and selected organs could also be buried with the remains of the animal. In this setting, the sacrifice was not a simple meal. It was part of the dead person's ongoing equipment and standing in the world beyond. This honouring of the dead did not stop after the first feast. If the deceased had been wealthy or socially important, sacrifices could continue for years. Tobacco, favoured foods, or other things enjoyed in life might be taken to the grave. Animals could be slaughtered again in the dead person's name. If a dead relative was believed to be guarding herds or protecting family wealth from the other world, then offerings had to continue for as long as that service was expected. A dead father or kinsman could be imagined as holding real responsibility beyond the grave, and as long as he performed it, the living remained obliged to feed and honour him. The dead were remembered not only on specially appointed days, but also in the course of ordinary feasting. A portion of drink might be poured onto the ground before anyone drank, a gesture offered to spirits in general, but especially to the departed. Food could be placed into small troughs, and then buried or set aside with the understanding that what was offered in this world became available in another. These actions reveal a world view in which no feast was entirely for the living alone. The dead remained members of the social world and still had a place at the edge of every table. Among Samoyedic peoples, there were often no fixed annual memorial days in the later formal sense, yet the dead were not forgotten. The animal that had carried the body to the grave might be sacrificed there, sometimes by being left impaled or otherwise dedicated at the burial place. In some areas, the dead were thought to remain near the living until a ritual specialist guided their shadow or soul to the proper land of the dead. If sacrifice was offered to them during that uncertain period, it was done with strict attention to direction, timing, and place. Such rites often took place behind the tent after sunset, with the offering oriented toward the west, the direction associated with the realm beyond ordinary human life. Among northern Ugrian groups, funerary sacrifice could be even more elaborate. The best reindeer belonging to the deceased might be brought to the cemetery and killed there, one after another, while the grave was still fresh. Their harness, sleighs, and other equipment were then overturned or placed beside the grave, while food was cooked nearby and eaten by the participants. Part of the offering remained with the dead. and part was consumed by the living. In later forms of the same tradition, the favourite reindeer of the deceased was slaughtered, its meat eaten, and its bones, horns, and harness left by the grave. The dead thus kept what truly belonged to them, even after the living had taken part in the sacrificial meal. Among the Vogels, the feast immediately after burial could include cooking cereal or meat and pouring some of it directly onto the coffin itself. The vessel used for preparation might then be broken and abandoned by the grave. If animals had conveyed the dead, these too could be killed near the burial place. Their hides were buried, their meat consumed, and their bones left with the dead. Even where the details varied, the logic remained remarkably steady. What served the dead in life, what carried them, fed them, or belonged most closely to them, could not always remain among the living after burial. In many northern areas, remembrance did not yet follow a strict calendar. Families agreed among themselves when to gather again, and this could happen after a month, 2 months, half a year, or a year. Yet the central act was consistent. Food was prepared, set out near the grave or at the doorway of the house, and then shared. Among some groups, tea, broth, spirits, and water were poured onto the earth for the dead before the meal was eaten by the living. Elsewhere, a portion of meat was placed in a special vessel by the grave, accompanied by words asking the dead not to remember the family with anger or harmful thoughts. The feast was not just nourishment. It was negotiation, reassurance, and the maintenance of peace between worlds. One of the most striking customs recorded among northern Ugrian peoples was the making of a memorial doll to represent the deceased. A widow might carve or commission a small human figure, dress it in the dead husband's clothes, ornament it with his belongings, and place it where he used to sit. The figure was treated not as a toy or symbol, but as a temporary stand-in for the dead person himself. Food was set before it. It was embraced, spoken to, kissed, and mourned. It might remain in the household for a year, or longer in some places, before being buried, burned, or transferred to the grave. The idea behind this practice was not difficult to understand. The dead were not gone all at once. Their presence lingered, and the doll gave that lingering presence a body through which the family could continue their obligations. In some communities, the image was reserved for especially important people. It might be fed at every meal, dressed in the morning and undressed at night. A widow deeply attached to her husband might even place it beside her in bed. In some traditions, it remained in the tent for 3 years, the length of time thought necessary for the body in the grave to lose its former form completely. In others, the period differed according to the sex of the dead person. At the end of that memorial span, the doll was taken to the graveyard and placed in a grave house or in some other resting place connected with the dead. Small structures found above graves, furnished with doll-like figures dressed in local clothing, preserve the memory of this custom vividly. A related practice also appears among some Samoyed groups, especially in connection with shamans. There, the image might not represent the dead person in ordinary human form, but rather the form taken by the shaman's soul when it left the body. In that case, the image preserved not only memory, but the spiritual identity of the dead specialist. Other peoples kept the dead person's clothes unwashed and carefully stored, bringing them out at memorial feasts, as though the person still occupied them. In some places, the clothes alone served as the presence of the dead, laid out in bed, placed near a dish, or treated with the same attention that elsewhere was given to a carved image. Among the Volga Finns, memorial observances followed a more regular sequence. Feasts were held on the burial day, then on the 3rd, 7th, and 40th day, and in some areas also on the yearly anniversary. Time was often counted by nights rather than days. giving these observances a more immediate and ritual rhythm. Blood sacrifice formed an essential part of many of these feasts. At the very least, a hen might be killed, but for greater memorials, larger animals could be offered. Without blood, many believed, the feast lacked real force and the dead would not receive what was due. The first feast began even before the body was taken away. Once the dead had been washed and dressed, bowls of food and drink were placed nearby, and the eldest members of the household addressed the deceased directly. They spoke words that were both affectionate and cautious. The dead person was wished well in the next life, but was also asked not to trouble the family, not to attack from front or behind, not to bring misfortune, and instead to guard the cattle and children. Everyone else then repeated the act, adding their own small offerings and words. In some regions, candles were lit for the newest dead, and also for the ancestors who were believed to come and meet the newcomer. Meat and broth were placed in a common vessel while names were spoken aloud, inviting the earlier dead to accept the new arrival kindly among them. Among Estonian communities, memorial foods, such as beans or peas, were prepared at the moment of departure to the grave. Portions were poured onto the coffin, and bread or other foods were laid upon it. Beer or spirits might be poured at the gate so that the dead would not go thirsty in the next life. Elsewhere among the vulgar Finns, the main funeral meal was held only after the return from the graveyard. No formal invitations were needed, because everyone already understood the obligation. Each guest brought something to the feast, and every contribution was named aloud in the hearing of the dead. A dish was placed for the person most recently buried, while other departed kin received food in a vessel set near the door, the point where the dead were thought to enter. At such meals, the first morsels and the first cup always belonged to the dead. If anything fell beneath the table, it was left there, as though it had already passed to those below. Food set aside for the dead was often later carried into the yard for the dogs. Their reaction could be read as a sign. If they refused the food, the dead were dissatisfied. If they fought over it, the dead themselves were not at peace with one another. This is the kind of detail that shows how immediate and practical the relationship with the dead remained. The memorial feast was not empty symbolism. It was watched for signs, measured by response, and judged according to whether the dead seemed pleased. Offerings were also taken to graves. Food was crumbled onto the earth, and drink was poured into pits dug near the head of the deceased. In earlier times, larger sacrifices seemed to have been more common than they later became. Rich men might be honoured with the death of a horse, and the meat of that horse would be shared by those gathered in memory of him. Archery contests could decide who would ride the dead person's horse to the grave and back before the animal was killed and cooked. Even when such large sacrifices faded, traces of the older custom remained in the expectation that a cow or other valuable animal should somehow be given after the death of a household head. The third and seventh day feasts varied in solemnity, but both marked the continued nearness of the dead. Pancakes, beer, porridge, milk, and spirits might be placed by a hat or kerchief, standing for the dead person's presence. The door could be opened briefly to invite the soul inside. On the seventh day, some communities went further, bringing the dead back in imagination from the grave, feeding him again, taking him even to the bathhouse, and only at dawn returning him to his new dwelling. These rites make sense only in a world where the dead still moved between grave and home and still required hospitality, as though they were living guests. The 40th day held exceptional importance. Across a broad region there was a belief that the dead remained close to the old home for 40 days, or 6 weeks in some variants. During that time the soul might dwell in the house, under the table, near the doorway, or among familiar objects. A bowl might be set at meals for the dead throughout this period. Towels were hung for the deceased to wipe after washing. No one dared touch these things. Speaking badly of the dead was avoided. The dead were still present, and the family had to behave accordingly. Because of this, the 40th day feast became not simply another remembrance, but a farewell of great force and complexity. Among the Cheremiss, for example, the dead person was ceremonially invited from the graveyard as though called to a great celebration. Family members drove to the cemetery with the best horses, bells sounding, food and drink laid out on a white cloth, and the dead addressed by name. Honey, bread, meat, cheese, pancakes, beer, and spirits were offered. The deceased was invited to rise, to come home, to meet widow, children and kin, and to bring along the ancestors and rulers of the lower world as well. A cushion was prepared in the wagon for the invisible guest, and throughout the ride home, the escort behaved as though he were truly seated there among them. At the home, the widow and children came out to meet the returning dead. Bread and drink were held in welcome. The cushion was carried inside and placed in a fixed seat reserved for the deceased, a place no living person would occupy. His clothes and shoes were hung where he could see them. Food and drink were set before him. Men even led him in imagination to inspect the cattle, the stacks of grain, the tools, and the bathhouse. The point was clear. Before final departure, the dead person was allowed one last complete visit to the world he had left. Only after sunset did the great memorial feast begin in full. Relations, neighbours, and friends arrived carrying meat, drink, and candles. Thick wax tapers were set on a special stand, one for the newly dead, others for relatives who had died earlier. A large taper burned through the entire night for the chief guest of the occasion. Everyone's attention centred on the cushion below the candles, where the deceased was believed to sit. Every dish prepared for the feast was first offered there. Separate vessels were laid out for the dead, and each guest approached kneeling, dropping a little food or drink into them while inviting the deceased to eat. Old men remained for long stretches in prayer, begging the dead to guard livestock from ravines and beasts, to protect grain from pests and storehouses from mice, and to watch over the family itself. As the night deepened, grief and festivity mixed together. Drink flowed, music began, the bagpipes sounded, dancing followed. The widow and children for a few hours could even seem to forget their sorrow. Yet the most dramatic moment was still to come. Near midnight or later, a man chosen for his resemblance to the dead entered the house dressed in the dead person's clothes. He took the reserved seat and was treated not as an actor but as the representative of the deceased. The widow embraced him as husband. The elders greeted him by the dead man's name. He was fed and questioned. Through him, the deceased spoke about life in the other world, advised the family to live in harmony, work hard, avoid quarrels, and continue remembering him. In return, the living begged for his protection. By dawn, the feast had to end. The surviving candles burned low. The dead man, it was said, now required his own rest. Everyone knelt and faced his seat for a final prayer. He was urged to return to the land of the other dead, to live there in peace, to make friends with those who had gone before, and not to frighten the living or come home uninvited. The taper stand, food vessels, drinking vessel, and clothes of the deceased were then carried out in procession, often with the widow at the head. The representative of the dead person went first. The group did not always return all the way to the cemetery. Sometimes they stopped at a hill outside the village and left the remaining food, tapers, and broken utensils there. Wooden spoons and cups were smashed so that the dead might truly receive them in the next world. The farewell was complete only when these final gifts had been released. In some districts, the 40th day required the sacrifice of a horse if the dead person was a man, or a cow if the dead person was a woman. The whole animal had to be consumed that same day, because festival food belonging to the dead could not be saved for later use. In some areas, a little one-legged table was erected in honour of the deceased, holding food and spoons as if for continued use beyond the feast. If ravines or streams lay nearby, a long pole could be laid across them as a bridge for the dead. This act reflects the widespread idea that the world beyond is reached by crossing, and that the dead must be helped over dangerous thresholds, just as much after burial as before it. Elsewhere, the farewell retained different dramatic forms. A widow might spend one last symbolic night with the cushion that had represented the dead person's place at the feast. In another district, a relative rode at full gallop from the cemetery after inviting the dead, shouting that he was coming, and the horse used in the rite was immediately slaughtered. Among the Mordvins, the dead could also return through a living representative dressed in their clothes, who described the condition of those in the other world, spoke about the activities of the dead, and even performed symbolic acts such as felling a small tree brought before him. At dawn, this deputy was escorted back to the grave and seated upon it for a final shared meal before the dead were left once more to themselves. Syrians also used a living representative, male or female according to the sex of the deceased, who departed first from the memorial meal while the others followed with candles, because it was believed that the dead person withdrew from the house in the body of that deputy. In Ingria, food was taken to the grave at the 6-week festival to invite the dead home, then placed untouched on the table, while a lamenting woman sang near the entrance. After the meal, the family went out toward the village road facing the cemetery, planting twigs or fire sticks into the ground as walking staffs for the dead. In Russian Karelia, an empty sled draped in white might accompany the invitation procession, ready to carry the deceased from the graveyard back to the former home for one final visit. Annual observances could also serve as a last separation. Among some Eastern Votiacs, the dead person's soul was thought to remain with the household until the first anniversary. Only then did the dead truly join the company of earlier ancestors. The white cloth torn on the burial day and hung in the house was taken at last to the grave and buried there. After this point, the clothes of the deceased could be given away. If the anniversary was neglected, it was feared that the dead would continue wandering near the village, because the other dead had not yet fully accepted the newcomer among them. In other places, the anniversary could still involve major sacrifice. Among Eastern Cheremis, the dead person's favourite horse was dressed with his clothes, led 3 times around the grave, then taken home and killed in his honour. The family declared that they had not used the horse after his death, and were now giving it back to him. After the feast, the bones were hung in a tree at the graveyard, while the hide might be sold for the benefit of the poor and fatherless. Even in death, the ritual had room both for sacrifice and for charity. Some memorial feasts were delayed for years, and became large, joyful gatherings almost modelled on a wedding. Among the Votiacs, this remarkable rite was known as the Wedding of the Dead, or the Horse Wedding. It was held in autumn, with horse sacrifice for a man and cattle sacrifice for a woman. Only relatives took part. Wedding songs were sung, gifts were exchanged, and by candlelight the bones of the sacrificial animal were finally carried to the graveyard and hung in a tree. The ceremony was cheerful rather than bleak, because the dead were being integrated into another kind of social life beyond the grave. The relationship between memory and agriculture also appears in customs such as the harvest of the dead among the Mordvins. Already at sowing time, the coming crop was asked to grow for both living and dead alike. During harvest, the relatives cut a portion of grain on behalf of the deceased, with the widow taking a leading role. sacrifices accompanied the rite. Here, the dead did not stand outside the yearly cycle of labour. They still shared in the fields, the reaping, and the prosperity of the household. Not every act of remembrance followed a fixed calendar. In many cases, the dead themselves were believed to demand attention. They could appear in dreams, send signs, or cause disturbances in daily life to remind the living that something had been neglected. Illness, in particular, was often interpreted as the direct result of a forgotten or offended ancestor. When such a cause was suspected, the response could be immediate and intense. Among some groups, a sick person might go to the grave of the deceased and beg forgiveness in a deeply humbling way, even approaching on hands and knees. The act was not symbolic humility, but a real attempt to repair a broken relationship with the unseen. The influence of the dead was not limited to sickness. Everyday misfortunes could also be traced back to them. A lost animal, a failed task, or a restless child might all be explained as the work of a dissatisfied ancestor. If a horse or cow disappeared, it could be said that a dead relative had hidden it. The solution was not to search blindly, but to perform a small memorial rite. Candles were lit, food was offered, and the dead were asked to return what they had taken. Even minor inconveniences such as tools breaking or simple household tasks going wrong could be enough to trigger such offerings. Life was full of signs, and many of them pointed back to the presence of the dead. Widows, in particular, were expected to remain attentive to these signs. Their connection to the deceased spouse was considered especially strong and ongoing. Physical discomfort could be interpreted as a sign of contact from the dead. A sudden pain might be understood as the result of a night encounter with the deceased husband. In such cases, a small offering had to be made at once. A candle was lit, food was prepared, and the dead were asked to be satisfied, and to leave the living in peace. Even remarriage did not erase this obligation. A widow entering a new marriage might still need to acknowledge the first husband through offerings, ensuring that no resentment remained. Alongside these personal acts of remembrance, there were also larger communal feasts dedicated to all the dead of a family or even an entire village. These gatherings were marked by the lighting of many candles, each representing a remembered ancestor. Some were lit for specific individuals, others for those whose names had already been forgotten, but whose presence was still acknowledged. These feasts took place at certain times of the year, often in spring and autumn, moments when the cycle of life and labour naturally turned. In some cases, a single household held the ceremony. In others, several related families gathered together. In older forms, even the whole village might unite in remembering its dead. The structure of these larger feasts closely resembled that of the smaller, individual memorials. Food and drink were prepared, and a portion was always set aside for the dead. When bread was broken or drink poured into a special vessel, words were spoken inviting all departed ancestors to receive their share. Even those whose identities had faded from memory were not excluded. A collective offering ensured that no one was entirely forgotten. Sometimes the feast extended into the following day, ending with a final act of farewell. When these gatherings lasted through the night, special care was taken to keep the dead entertained. It was believed that each living participant was accompanied by a spirit of similar age, someone who had once been close to them. The behaviour of the living directly affected the state of the dead. If a person laughed, ate well, and enjoyed the gathering, the spirit beside him would also feel joy and satisfaction. If he was withdrawn or refused food, the spirit would suffer the same. This belief encouraged abundance. People ate and drank generously, not only for themselves, but to ensure that their invisible companions did not go hungry. Work was avoided, as it would burden the dead with labour. Sleep was also discouraged, because a sleeping person might cause the accompanying spirit to remain behind when the others return to their own world. One of the most striking moments in the yearly cycle of remembrance occurred during the early spring, around the time later associated with Easter. This period was believed to be a time when the dead left their resting places and moved freely among the living. It was a night of heightened danger and sacred attention. People avoided ordinary tasks, refrained from making noise, and prepared their homes carefully. Food was placed on tables, benches, and even in bathhouses, where the dead were believed to go to cleanse themselves. Special vessels were arranged with candles for each remembered ancestor, and spoons were laid out for unseen hands. Offerings during this time were accompanied by direct appeals. The dead were invited to eat and drink, but also asked to grant health, prosperity, and protection. They were urged not to bring illness or misfortune, not to harm cattle, and not to trouble the living. Names were spoken aloud, ensuring that each ancestor was included. Even those without surviving relatives were remembered through shared offerings. Once the ritual was complete, the food was often taken outside and given to animals, whose reaction could again be read as a sign of the dead's satisfaction. This night also demanded protection. People believed that spirits, not all of them benevolent, moved freely at this time. Weapons were gathered, and in some places groups went out to make noise and drive away dangerous forces. Boundaries were marked around homes with ashes or tools. Fires were lit, and smoke was used to purify living spaces. Young men might stand guard through the night, watching for any sign of approaching spirits. These beings could appear in animal form, and their presence was taken seriously. The following morning, purification rituals completed the cycle, often involving fire and movement through smoke or flame. Similar ideas about the wandering of the dead appeared in other seasons as well. Among Baltic Finns, autumn was often seen as a time when spirits returned. Entire months were associated with the presence of the dead. During these periods, noise was avoided, homes were cleaned, and food was left out at night. These practices later blended with Christian observances, but their underlying structure remained older. A notable autumn festival included the preparation of food not only for the living, but also for unseen guests. Offerings were made in various places around the farm, including barns, fields, and forests, showing that the dead were believed to move through all parts of the landscape. This autumn feast also included elements of divination. People attempted to learn about the future by observing small signs. Objects were counted, patterns were watched, and the results were interpreted as indications of coming events, including death. Fire played a role here as well, often lit on hills to drive away harmful forces. Disguises and masks were used by participants who moved from house to house, demanding hospitality. These masked figures echoed the presence of the dead themselves, blurring the boundary between the living and the unseen. In other regions, winter brought its own version of these beliefs. During midwinter celebrations, the dead were again thought to move among the living. Silence was required, offerings were set out, and care was taken to avoid provoking unseen visitors. Water sources were protected, and metal objects were used to guard against harm. In some traditions, spirits were imagined climbing into the dwelling itself, passing unnoticed among those inside. If they were treated poorly, they could take revenge in severe ways. To prevent this, food and drink were always prepared in advance. Certain northern rituals from this season included symbolic objects placed in trees, such as small boat-like containers filled with food. These were left high above the ground, possibly as offerings to spirits associated with the dead. Trees themselves were marked, and blood from sacrificed animals might be applied to them. These acts suggest a connection between the dead, the landscape, and sacred objects that served as bridges between worlds. Elsewhere, large communal memorial feasts could be organized after long intervals, bringing together extended families or entire communities. Food was prepared in abundance, and the dead were invited formally from the graveyard. Tables were set in separate rooms, chairs left empty, and spaces arranged for unseen guests. Invitations were spoken aloud, often accompanied by weeping, urging the dead to come and bring their own companions. The living then withdrew briefly, allowing the dead time to partake before returning to share the meal themselves. Some communities also developed rituals to honour those who had been completely forgotten. These unnamed dead were still believed to exist and to have influence. When natural problems such as insect infestations threatened crops, special ceremonies were held in their honour. These could resemble festive processions, with music, dancing, and structured roles similar to a wedding. Offerings were made in fields and at burial places, asking the forgotten dead not to harm the crops. In some cases, large animals were sacrificed, and their remains carefully treated. These ceremonies show that even those without living memory still held a place in the moral and spiritual order. Despite all these rituals, most of the dead eventually faded from memory. Only a few remain known over long periods. Shamans, leaders, or particularly respected ancestors might be remembered as protective figures, almost like household guardians. These individuals were believed to watch over the community, guiding and protecting it. Their influence extended beyond memory into identity itself. This connection between the living and their ancestors also shaped cultural identity. Among some northern groups, the dead were imagined as continuing to live in a world that closely resembled the one above ground. They were thought to have the same houses, the same clothing, and even the same language. The living were urged to preserve their traditions, not only for their own sake, but to remain in harmony with those who had come before. Language, customs, and daily practices were seen as gifts from the ancestors, and abandoning them could bring misfortune. For Finno-Ugric peoples, ideas about the next world can be seen most clearly in the way the dead were buried. The grave was not prepared for a soul drifting into emptiness. It was prepared for someone who was expected to go on living in a new setting, much like the old one. Food was placed with the dead because the dead would still hunger. Tools were buried because they would still work. Fishing gear, knives, wood-cutting implements, clothing, and household objects were not empty symbols. They were practical necessities for a life believed to continue beyond the grave, much as it had before. The dead were imagined as hunting, fishing, chopping wood, tending animals, sowing fields, keeping bees, visiting one another, marrying, and carrying on the same ordinary tasks that had filled their days on earth. This other life was not imagined as effortless. The dead could still suffer from cold and want. In some places, when living people sat by an outdoor fire and warmed themselves, they deliberately left behind wood for the dead to use in their turn. Such a detail reveals the basic character of this belief, more clearly than any formal doctrine. The dead were not remote beings of pure spirit. They remained vulnerable, needy, and very close to the conditions of ordinary human life. Some traditions even imagine danger continuing after death. Among certain groups, the dead could face a second death in the world below, as though life beyond the grave were not final security, but another stage of existence with its own risks and limits. The most widespread idea placed this world of the dead beneath the earth. Songs and stories speak of the dead going down into the land below, a place hidden under the surface of the living world. Yet this underground world was not entirely foreign. It resembled the world above in shape and structure, though everything there seemed reversed. The dead were thought to move as if upside down in relation to the living. Rivers ran the opposite way. Trees grew downward. The sun rose where it should have set, and set where it should have risen. Time itself moved strangely there. Some believed that the dead grew younger as the years passed, becoming smaller and smaller until they vanished altogether or returned to earthly life through rebirth within the family. Others imagined the dead slowly shrinking into tiny creatures, as if the soul itself wore away over time. This vision of an inverted world also shaped ritual behavior among the living. Acts directed toward the dead were often deliberately performed in reverse. The left hand might be used instead of the right. Movements could go against the course of the sun. Garments might be worn inside out. Offerings could be placed upside down, and certain harvest rites for the dead were carried out backward. These strange reversals reflected a powerful conviction that the dead inhabited a mirror world where familiar rules no longer worked in the ordinary way. The underworld was not chaos, but a reversed order. It followed its own logic, and ritual had to match it. Just as the living had once organized themselves in kin-based villages, the dead too were believed to dwell in communities. The graveyard was not only a place of burial, it was the beginning of a village below the earth. Each coffin was the private house of its occupant, and all together formed a settlement of the dead. Among the vulgar Finns, the first person buried in a cemetery could become its ruler, a figure responsible for order among the graves. Special candles and offerings were made to this first inhabitant, who acted almost as the head of the dead community. The underground village was imagined as disciplined and social, not empty or disorderly. Newcomers did not necessarily receive an easy welcome. Those who had been quarrelsome or troublesome in life might be unwelcome among the dead as well. To die far from home was therefore deeply troubling. If the dead were tied to the place where the body lay, then burial away from one's own kin meant separation not only from the living family, but also from the ancestral company below the earth. This helps explain why some peoples performed mock burials or substitute rites for those who died in distant places. The purpose was to draw the dead person spiritually back toward the family burial ground, where the dead of the same line were already gathered. The ideal afterlife was not solitary. It was communal and tied to kinship, land, and memory. Among Finnic peoples, this underground world had names that make its meaning clear. It was imagined as a place beneath the earth, a realm of the dead where each one had a dwelling of his own. Folk poetry often describes the house of the dead in concrete and physical terms. The dead were not thought to float in darkness, but to inhabit actual structures, close in idea to the grave itself. Songs speak of the underworld in the language of buildings, roofs, floors, walls, and enclosed space. The grave became the visible entrance to the invisible house. In some traditions, the world of the dead was not only underground but also separated by a river. This river lay in darkness, beyond the light of sun and moon, and crossing it was part of the soul's journey. Stories speak of a bridge over this black water, sometimes narrow and difficult, and later beliefs attached ideas of judgment to this crossing. In some versions, only the worthy reached the far side safely, while the wicked fell into the dark stream below. These images seem to have grown stronger over time under outside influence, but once they entered local tradition, they blended easily with older ideas about the dangerous road to the next life. Another widespread image replaced the bridge with a boat. In songs and tales, the dead or the soul travelling to the next world had to be ferried across the river of death. This helps explain why boats, boat-shaped coffins, or miniature vessels appear so often in northern burial traditions. The crossing of water became one of the great symbols of transition. In some versions, the dead were rowed across by a figure from the underworld. In others, improper handling of clipped nails or ritual impurity might help build the boat that carried the dead away. However the image changed from place to place, the essential idea remained the same. Death was a journey, and water marked the boundary. Guarding this world beyond were beings that gradually took on more definite form in folk imagination. The underworld could have gates, rulers, ferrymen, and hounds. Some of these elements are clearly later additions shaped by contact with neighbouring traditions. But they settled naturally into Finno-Ugric thought because they matched older ideas already present. The land of the dead was never just an abstract condition. It was a real place with roads, entrances, boundaries, and powers governing it. Among the Scandinavian Lapps, the common dwelling place of the dead was ruled by a female figure associated with death itself. Sacrifices were made to her and to the dead in general, often using black animals buried in the earth. During the Christian era, this underworld began to divide more sharply into better and worse regions. Some dead might reach a higher, brighter realm, while others were believed to suffer in a darker and harsher place ruled by another being, feared, but still capable of receiving offerings. This dark ruler was not always thought of as a pure devil. In some situations he resembled an old plague spirit, or lord of disease, dangerous, but not outside the logic of sacrifice. The dead world thus became more layered over time, but older habits of worship continued beneath these later ideas. Not all traditions imagined the dead living only underground. Among the Lapps, an important parallel belief placed the dead in sacred mountains. These mountains were not empty heights, but inhabited places where the dead lived, much as the living did, in dwellings like tents, speaking the same language, travelling with reindeer, and forming communities of their own. The spirits of these mountains were not merely ghosts, they were protectors and helpers, inherited through kin or marriage and strengthened by sacrifice. Families might turn to particular holy mountains for aid, believing that their dead or spirit allies lived there. Some mountains were thought stronger than others, more ready to hear, quicker to act. These mountain spirits could also be dangerous. They might summon a person's soul before its time, causing illness. In such cases, the shaman had to bargain with them and bring the lost soul back. The link between the living and these mountain-dwelling dead was therefore active and immediate. After death, people hoped to join the mountain that had protected them most in life. There, they in turn might become spirits, capable of helping their own descendants. In some southern areas, these mountain beings began to resemble the hidden folk of neighbouring Scandinavian belief, but their role as ancestral protectors remained clear. There are traces of a similar idea in western Finland, where the dead were sometimes believed to pass from the grave into nearby forest hills. Certain songs and magical formulas preserve hints that hills and wooded heights could serve as places where the dead or spirit beings gathered. These beliefs do not always appear clearly, but they suggest that for some communities, the world of the dead wasn't only below the ground, but also hidden within the landscape, especially in remote, elevated, or wooded places. Direction mattered as well. Because spirits were thought to move especially at night, the land of the dead was often placed toward darkness, toward sunset, toward the north, or beyond the known edges of the world. Among the northern Votiacs and Vogels, the realm of the dead lay far away in the Arctic north, at the place where the great river emptied into the sea. There, the road divided according to the fate awaiting each soul. In some accounts, the underworld had several levels, with the worst lot reserved for those who had lived badly. Although such moral sorting seems to be a later development, the setting itself is older and powerful. A dark northern opening where river water disappears into mystery, and where the road beyond human life begins. The journey there was often imagined by boat. Songs describe the dead seated in a vessel, bound for the world below. This idea fits naturally in lands shaped by rivers, lakes, marshes, and dangerous northern waters. The river that carries water downward becomes the path that carries the dead away. A people living with boats would easily imagine the soul travelling the same way. The underworld was not only beneath the earth, it was also downstream, beyond the current, at the point where known waters vanished. Finnish poetry preserves another closely related image in the idea of a northern land of darkness. This place appears as the source of sickness, death and danger, ruled by a threatening mistress and approached through gates, rivers, rapids, or whirlpools. Sometimes the Death River becomes a devouring current that swallows all waters. Sometimes it resembles a flaming whirlpool in the far north. Such imagery may reflect real northern phenomena transformed by imagination. Powerful rapids, maelstrom-like currents, or even the eerie fire-like movement of the northern sky. In this vision, the road to the dead leads not only underground but into the dark and fearful edge of the world. In Russian Karelia and neighbouring regions, ideas from Christian and older northern traditions mixed to form a richly detailed image of the soul's road after death. Songs describe the dead being escorted by heavenly figures, guided across rivers and marshes, passing forests, snakes, bridges and resting places until they reach broad fields and tables loaded with food. The dead need guides, boats, road makers, and protections purchased through good deeds done in life. This image preserves a very old structure beneath newer names. The dead do not simply arrive. They travel, overcome obstacles, and require help at every stage. Not all dead, however, were thought to go to the same place. A very old distinction appears in the belief that those who died violently did not descend to the ordinary underworld at all. Those killed in battle, struck by lightning, or torn apart by wild animals, could be thought to rise upward instead. Their souls were believed to reach heaven or another realm above, rather than the common land of the dead below the earth. Some stories tell of heroes whose souls climbed upward after a blow in battle, only returning if their time had not yet fully come. Others say that such souls lived in the sky and could even come back to aid their comrades. This belief seems closely tied to northern visions of the aurora borealis. Among several peoples of the far north, the northern lights were seen not simply as a natural display, but as the visible struggle of those who had died by violence. The lights were imagined as the souls of the slain still fighting in the heavens, shedding blood across the sky. Some feared the lights for this reason. They represented not peace, but restless, warlike dead, continuing their struggle beyond the grave. Similar interpretations appear across Arctic regions, suggesting that the extraordinary sight of the northern lights naturally inspired a belief in a sky realm reserved for those whose deaths were sudden and bloody. In some Finnish songs, this upper road is hinted at through the image of a great tree or bridge stretched toward the north, providing passage for those who died without illness. This may preserve a memory of an old northern cosmic image, where the dead of battle travelled not below ground, but along a path in the sky. Whether imagined as a bridge, a tree trunk, or the shining band of the heavens, the idea marks a second destiny, distinct from the ordinary underworld village of the family dead. Yet even these worlds of the dead did not include everyone. Some souls were believed to remain trapped among the living. This was especially true of children hidden or killed before they could be properly received into family and burial community. Such spirits were imagined as wandering, homeless, and dangerous. Other restless dead included those lost in forests, drowned in water, or denied burial. Without a grave, without rites, and without a place among kin, they could not enter the settled world beyond. They remained on the margins, haunting the living world because they had been refused the road to the dead. Among many Finno-Ugric peoples, hunting and fishing were never treated as ordinary work. They belonged to a sacred zone of life, where success depended not only on skill, but on correct conduct, careful language, and ritual purity. The animals of the forest and the creatures of the water were not approached casually. They were spoken of in guarded terms, handled according to inherited rules, and surrounded by customs that reveal how deeply people believed these beings could hear, understand, remember, and respond. This is especially clear in the language used for prey. Hunters often avoided the common name of an animal and replaced it with titles, praise names, or secret expressions. The bear above all received a remarkable number of respectful names. He could be called the master of the forest, the old one of the mountains, the wise one, the holy animal, or the dog of God. Other peoples used names such as the fur man or the wild dweller, while Finnic speakers preferred affectionate and indirect titles, such as honeypaw or great forest. The reason was simple and deeply serious. To say the true name carelessly was to risk being heard. The animal might take offence, grow wary, or turn its anger against the hunter. This same caution extended beyond the animal itself. During hunts, especially during bear rites, parts of the animal, hunting weapons, and even tools could receive substitute names. On fishing expeditions, too, speech became guarded and ceremonial. Even in later times, some coastal communities continued to use special terms for nets, gear, and catches when they were out on the water, as though ordinary language itself had to be suspended in the presence of sacred work. Purity was a central requirement in both hunting and fishing. People, tools, and even the spaces associated with the catch had to be ritually clean. Purification could be achieved through smoke, through fire, through washing, or through sprinkling with water. These methods were widespread and clearly ancient. Hunting, in particular, was thought to demand a state of inner and outer fitness. Animals, it was said, favoured pure people. This belief shaped the behaviour not only of the hunters themselves, but also of those who remained at home. In some places, if people knew hunters had reached the lair of a bear, those in the village avoided dirty work such as scrubbing floors or washing clothes. During periods marked by death, many communities suspended hunting and fishing entirely. Some would not even cross running water while a corpse remained unburied in the settlement. Sexual abstinence, especially before or during hunting and fishing periods, also formed part of this wider logic of ritual separation. The act of setting out for the hunt was itself treated as something sacred. Among the Lapps, hunters and fishers did not always leave by the ordinary entrance of the tent. Instead, they used a special rear opening that women were forbidden to use. This was the same opening through which the bodies of game and fish were later brought in. It was a threshold marked off from ordinary domestic life. Blood, prey, sacred danger, and ritual success all passed through it. Echoes of this practice survived elsewhere. Among Votiac communities, the head of the bear might be brought into the house through the window rather than through the usual way. Among some Finnic groups, hunters departing to pursue a bear could pass through a partly open doorway in a very specific manner, avoiding the ordinary route as if the hunt demanded a different path from everyday life. Secrecy also mattered at the moment of departure. One was meant to leave quietly without meeting others along the way, and especially without crossing paths with women. Across a wide northern zone, women were excluded from the hunt itself, not because the hunt lacked importance for them, but because contact between hunters and women during these moments was seen as spiritually risky. Instead, women were assigned their own important role at the return. They had to receive the hunters with prescribed ceremonies, helping manage the dangerous transition from forest or water back into household life. When a hunter came back with valuable game, his wife might meet him with prepared liquids, purifying gestures, and ritual washing. These acts were not casual domestic welcome. They were essential protections, intended to preserve future luck and to cleanse away the force carried back from the sacred encounter. This system of separation shaped food as well. Women in many places were forbidden to eat certain animals or certain parts of animals, especially those linked to special hunting grounds or sacred prey. Even when they were allowed a share, it was carefully restricted. Slaughtering and cooking large game were often men's tasks. In the far north, even household sacrifices involving domestic animals were carried out in ritual spaces behind the tent, places where women were not permitted to tread. Hunting, slaughter, sacrifice, and the sacred handling of blood formed a connected world governed by old distinctions and inherited caution. At the centre of this animal world stood the bear. Among the Finno-Ugric peoples of the north, no wild creature approached the bear in status. He was not merely strong or dangerous. He was intelligent, watchful, near human in understanding, and surrounded by a special aura of holiness. Among vulgar peoples, although the old ceremonies had faded, many of the beliefs remained. The bear was thought to understand human speech, even if unable to answer in words. If someone encountered him in the forest, it was proper to uncover the head, to bow, even to kneel. One showed respect not just to avoid attack, but because the bear was in some sense lord of the wilderness. Even after death, he was believed capable of recognizing enemies and punishing mockery or disrespect. Laughing near the body of a slain bear was therefore dangerous. The bear also seems to have held a role in oath-taking and communal seriousness. Among Samoyeds, Ostiacs and Vogels, oaths could be sworn over the bear. A person would bite the hair, nose, claws or teeth of the animal while declaring that if he spoke falsely, the bear should bite him in return, just as he now bit the bear. The animal thus stood as a witness and enforcer of truth. This suggests that the bear was not only sacred in ritual, but morally weighty in social life. The fullest bear rites preserved in the old records are those of the Lapps. These ceremonies show a world in which the bear hunt was not simply a practical killing, but a highly ordered drama involving divination, rank, songs, purification, feasting, apology, and burial. In autumn, hunters tracked bears to their winter dens, but often left them undisturbed until deep snow made escape difficult. Only later, usually near the end of winter, did the actual hunt take place. Even then, it did not begin at once. The drum had first to be consulted to learn whether success was possible. Once the answer was favourable, the hunters arranged themselves in a formal procession according to role and rank. The tracker led the way, followed by the one who had interpreted the drum's message, then the bravest men who would kill the bear, and after them the others, each with clearly assigned duties. One would make fire, one would carry water, another would later cook, and so on. Every role mattered because every stage of the event belonged to tradition. When the den was reached, the bear was killed with spear and gun and dragged from its hiding place. Immediately, the tone shifted. The hunters did not simply celebrate victory, they sang to the bear, begged forgiveness for disturbing its sleep, thanked it for the little trouble it had caused, and praised the fact that no weapon had broken in the struggle. The body was beaten lightly with twigs, marked with signs of triumph, and sometimes adorned. One custom involved fastening a woven ring of fur around the lower jaw, then dragging the animal a short distance by a belt attached to the ring while the others sang. Men gestured with their spears against the dead body as though confronting it one last time in play, The bear was then covered with fir branches and left until the next day. The approach home was another sacred moment. Long before the hunters reached the camp, their songs announced success. The women inside the tent heard the singing and prepared themselves in festive dress. Men and women answered one another in song, turning the return into a ceremonial exchange. The leader might strike the back entrance of the tent with a specially prepared branch, naming the fallen bear in a coded way according to its sex. Sometimes, the hunter's wife or another woman had already prepared a branch decorated with copper rings. Other accounts describe a man pushing an alder branch under the wall of the tent, drawing it back 3 times so that his wife would understand that the holy prey had been taken. The household did not simply receive hunters. It received sacred danger. The women were forbidden to go near the bear itself, yet their role in the return was crucial. As the men entered by the sacred back door, the women covered their faces. If they wished to look, they had to do so through a ring of copper or brass. At the same time, they spat alderbark liquid into the faces of the men and even onto the dogs that had taken part in the hunt. The hunters themselves often painted their bodies with this reddish liquid, marking arms, chests, and forehead. Women might redden their own faces as well. Brass rings and chains were placed on the men, and even on the reindeer used in the ceremonies. The atmosphere was festive, but everything served a protective purpose. Colour, metal, branches, and ritual gesture all helped manage the dangerous power attached to the bear. The day of the return was devoted entirely to celebration. Men and women ate separately. Work ceased, people slept in the finery acquired during the feast, and husbands did not sleep beside their wives. The next day, the bear was carried to a special cutting-up place, often a small structure built for the purpose some distance from the dwelling. The men who went to fetch the body again adorned themselves and the reindeer with brass ornaments, marked the animals with alder liquid, and sang as they travelled. They were careful not to cross a woman's path, and women in turn avoided the track left by the bear. In some places, women were forbidden to use the reindeer that had pulled the bear for a whole year. The cutting-up place was itself treated almost like a shrine. The carcass was laid out, sprinkled with alder liquid, and provided with a small bark vessel filled with the same substance and set before its nose. Knives and vessels were decorated with brass. The children might watch, carrying news back and forth to the women. All the while the men sang. They guessed the homeland of the bear, thanked it for its fur, praised the honour that had come to it, and urged it to tell other bears how well it had been treated so that they too would come willingly in the future. Even while dividing the carcass, the men watched for omens and tried to interpret the behaviour of those in the dwelling place. No bone of the bear was to be broken. Flesh was cut away with care, arteries and sinews left as undisturbed as possible. The blood was cooked first with fat and consumed at once as a great delicacy. Bear blood was credited with special power. It might be smeared on the bodies of hunters or on wives, children, doorways, and even the tent supports. The head was left for last, still attached to windpipe and entrails. The mouth skin could temporarily be worn by the one who skinned it, giving him special distinction. When the meat was distributed, strict rules governed who received which parts. Women were excluded from the forepart and from the most honoured organs. The heart was treated as holy flesh and eaten eagerly by the men. The kidneys carried a reputation for stirring desire. The gall could harden the spirit. Yet bear fat was dangerous if used improperly, because the animal might then learn who had killed it. Metal knives were not to touch the meat as people ate. Only fingers or wood were proper. Nothing was to be saved. All had to be consumed at one sitting. The women received their share only through another ceremony of protection. The men bringing meat into the dwelling were again splashed with older liquid and viewed through metal rings. Women had to take their first bite through a brass ring, or at least hold one before the mouth, and they ate using wooden sticks, not their bare hands. Finally, the tail, cooked separately, was brought in. The special branch prepared earlier reappeared, and women and children attached brass rings to it. Once the tail had been eaten and cleaned, it was tied to the branch and returned to the men. Only then did the women remove their coverings and receive thanks for not disturbing the feast. Songs preserved from these ceremonies show that the event had a dramatic dimension. In some of them, the bear itself seems to speak, saying it has come from the deep forests to the crowded lands of people, or that it had wished to return to its old places but had been prevented by the hunters. Such songs suggest that the feast was not only for the bear, but also from the bear's point of view. The hunters tried to imagine what it would say, how it would feel, and how it should be addressed. When all the flesh had been consumed, the bones were arranged with extraordinary care. A pit was dug roughly the size of the animal, lined with twigs, and the skeleton was laid inside in proper order. Missing bones had to be replaced, even if that meant taking them from a dog that had stolen one. The skin of the mouth was replaced, as were the sexual parts and the tail. The rings that had decorated the tail were removed, and sometimes reused, to decorate drums or given as rewards. A bark vessel filled with alder liquid was again set before the bear's nose. Sometimes other objects were buried with it. In some traditions, the joints of the backbone were threaded on a twig and the skull attached, forming a reconstructed image of the bear's form. The burial ended with direct speech to the bear. Hunters begged it to run and tell the other bears of the honours shown to it, so that they would not fear hunters in the future. The grave was carefully covered to prevent disturbance by dogs or wild animals. In some places, a small spear was erected over it. Elsewhere, the bones were arranged upright or hung in trees near the place of death. The forms varied, but the intention was consistent. The bear had to be preserved whole in death, honoured as a person of rank, and sent back in a condition from which life might somehow return. The skin, which had remained hidden during the meal, was then spread out against a tree or on snow, decorated with brass. The women were led out veiled and given bows or branches with which to aim at the skin. Good aim promised future success in marriage or in the household's hunting luck. The woman who struck well might become the wife of a great bear hunter, or help bring success to her husband. Afterwards, she had the honour of sewing special cloth ornaments for the men and the reindeer involved in the hunt. Even at this late stage, the women still looked upon the skin only through metal rings. Purification did not end with the feast itself. For several days afterward, hunters remained apart from their wives. On the third day, they underwent a final cleansing. They washed in water mixed with ash, ran repeatedly around the cutting-up place, entered and left the dwelling in prescribed ways, and imitated the growl of the bear while doing so. In some versions, women or old women threw hot ashes after them. Only after these rites could brass ornaments be removed and ordinary married life resume. Each slain bear was remembered by hammering a copper nail into a spear, gun, or drum. To kill a bear was one of the highest marks of honour a hunter could attain. Similar honour was also shown to the polar bear when it drifted ashore in the far north. Hunters who killed one celebrated noisily, roaring like the animal, praising their bravery, and bowing before the body. Salt fish was placed in its mouth, and the hunters asked it to tell its kindred that it had not been treated badly. The same theme appears again. The dead animal is expected to report back to its own people, and future success depends on that testimony. Among Votiacs and Vogels, related bear writers took other forms. The bear skin or head was placed in the sacred rear part of the house, where women could not go. Water and smoke were used to purify all who entered. Metal objects again played a strong protective role. Eyes were covered with bark or coins, the nose with metal, and the skin decorated according to whether the bear had been male or female. Rings were slipped over its claws, so that it would not frighten women later in the berry season. Food and drink were set before it. The skin might remain for several days while nightly feasts were held, with songs telling of the bear's birth, its adventures, its killing, and its life after death. Among the Vogels, these ceremonies developed into a true dramatic performance. Men wore masks of birch bark, painted and bearded, and spoke in altered voices so the bear would not recognize them, if angered by the play. They claimed to be strangers from far away, hiding their identity from the spirit of the animal. This reveals the emotional core behind the masks. The bear was feared not only in life, but after death. One had to honor it, feed it, entertain it, and conceal oneself from its vengeance. The Finns called the bear feast a wedding. The house had to be cleaned, everyone dressed in their best, and a young man or woman was chosen to play the role of bride or bridegroom, depending on the sex of the bear. The bear's head was placed high on the table and the meat arranged in proper order. Songs accompanied the procession bringing it home, and these songs often insisted that the hunters were innocent, that the bear had somehow died by mischance or wounded itself. This polite denial of guilt fits the wider pattern perfectly. The bear must not think itself murdered by deliberate malice. Even while honoured as a guest, it had to be deceived gently and sent away in peace. The skull often received special treatment. It could be left on the table overnight and then carried in solemn procession to a chosen tree, accompanied by singing and symbolic rolls as if in a wedding train. There it was raised or fixed in place. Samoyeds also preserved skulls in trees or on poles. Other prized animals such as wild reindeer, otters, foxes, wolves and fish were treated with comparable respect, though usually with less ceremony than the bear. Bones were preserved, buried, hung in trees or returned to water depending on the nature of the animal. Forest creatures belonged to dry ground and were hidden in sand or rocky places. Water creatures had their bones sent back into springs or streams. Among the Lapps, sacred stones had already drawn notice centuries ago, and by the early modern period they were described again and again as one of the most striking features of northern religion. These stones stood in different landscapes depending on the lives of the people who revered them. Fell Lapps placed them on mountain heights. Fishing communities kept them by fjords, on headlands jutting into the sea, on islands and beside rivers or rapids. They were known as sides, and old accounts make clear that they were once found almost everywhere across Lapland. They were not carved by human hands in the ordinary sense. Most were natural stones, shaped by water, frost, and time, often with strange hollows or silhouettes that made them seem alive. The most valued of all were those whose outlines suggested a human form, though some resembled animals, and even certain great rocks fixed in the earth could be treated with the same reverence. In some sacred spots, several sides stood together, arranged in a way that made them seem like a family rather than a single being. At one northern site, where such a place survived into recent memory, small mounds stood in a group, each surrounded by stones of different sizes. The largest seemed to mark the leading figure, while the smaller ones gathered round it, like dependents or kin. The care given to these stones reveals how powerful they were, believed to be. Their places were kept fresh and living. Wherever possible, a side stood on green ground, surrounded by thick grass. In summer, it might be decorated with birch leaves, in winter with fir branches. The base on which it rested had to remain green, and when the leaves or needles dried out, they were replaced. This was not mere ornament. It was a sign that the place of the spirit had to be tended like something alive. When a Lapp wished to ask for help, to seek luck, or to learn something about the future, he went to the sacred place and took the stone in his hands if it was small enough. Bareheaded, he would speak to it directly while trying to lift it. If the stone seemed to grow heavy and refused to rise, that was taken as a refusal. Even a small stone could become impossible to move when the spirit within it would not agree. If the request was later granted, the worshipper returned with an offering in thanks. The spirit could even be asked what kind of offering it wanted, and the answer was again sought through the same strange heaviness or ease. When the sacred being was not a movable stone but a fixed rock or cliff, the act of questioning changed form. The hand was laid directly upon the rock, and questions were spoken aloud until the correct one was reached. It was believed that the hand could remain stuck fast until the hidden truth had been named. In this way, the holy stone did not merely symbolize power. It responded, resisted, accepted, and made its will known. The place around it was therefore marked off from ordinary life. Mountains carrying such stones were thought of as holy mountains. Rivers and lakes near them became holy waters. This language survived because the fear attached to these places lasted long after the old rites themselves had weakened. That fear shaped behaviour in very precise ways. Sacred places were approached with caution and proper dress. Some reports describe worshippers putting on festive clothing before going near them, bowing or bending low even while still at a distance. Families returned year after year, and if no new offering could be made, then at least the remains of earlier offerings had to be moved or attended to. It was considered dangerous to build a dwelling too close by, because the cries of children or the ordinary noise of daily life might anger the spirit. While passing a holy mountain, one should not fall asleep, since that looked like irreverence. Loud speech, careless shooting, or unnecessary noise were avoided. Blue garments were sometimes removed before entering the sacred zone. Women were expected to cover their faces or turn their heads away, and men themselves had to be careful not to wear things associated with women if they approached the site. Even objects washed together with women's things could become unsuitable in that context. Such rules show how deeply the sacred stone had become embedded in a larger system of purity, distance, and danger. In some places, these older fears survived with extraordinary force. A holy spot in the far north was still remembered as a place where boats must pass silently, with the rowlocks dampened so that no creaking would offend the god. In winter, sledges were to move slowly past, and a traveller had to look straight ahead rather than glance aside. After passing, one was expected to stop at a proper distance and offer drink in the spirit's honour before allowing the reindeer to run again. Anyone who failed in these respects risked a storm, a blizzard, or some sudden disaster. Other stories tell of places where women could not ride past in boats, but had to go on foot along the shore, or where the mere nearness of such a place was said to affect them physically. The sacred place was therefore not simply respected. It was treated as a zone of real force, capable of binding, punishing, or afflicting those who crossed it wrongly. People turned to these spirits in nearly every area of life. A Seidi might be asked for luck on a journey, for fish, for game, for the health of reindeer, or for rescue from sickness and misfortune. Vows were made before the request was granted and redeemed once the need had been met. When these stones were also believed capable of sending storms, controlling travel, and defending or punishing their worshippers, it becomes clear how broad their power was imagined to be. Yet the question remains, what exactly were these beings? Why should a stone, a rock, or a place in the landscape be treated as if it were alive? A clue lies in the fact that each cider belonged to a family or clan. Old reports say plainly that every family had its own sacred being in the land where it lived and moved. A cider, honoured by a whole settlement or lineage, was stronger than one tied only to a single household. Some were remembered as the chief spirit of an entire village, while others served only one branch of a kin group. Worship passed from father to son. Children inherited the sacred places and the spirits associated with them, just as they inherited other vital elements of family life. This alone strongly suggests that the cider was not simply a nature spirit in the abstract, but a guardian linked to ancestry, belonging, and inherited protection. The connection becomes even clearer in regions where the cider was associated with the spirits dwelling in holy mountains. These mountain beings, known from many northern traditions, were already closely linked with the dead, with ancestral protectors, and with the hidden population living beneath the earth or inside the heights. There are reports that sacrifices to such mountain spirits were made at or near a sacred stone. Other accounts state that sides had first been noticed in places where people had heard uncanny sounds, ghostly noises, or signs of invisible presences. Among Finnish Lapps, it was said that anyone who slept near one of these holy places might dream of strange beings, animals, or human figures. One must also never speak badly of the dead in their vicinity, because the underground people would be offended. These details point consistently in the same direction. The sacred stone marked the presence of a family or clan spirit closely tied to the dead. Stories about these beings reinforce that impression. A cider could appear in human form to its worshipper. One old description tells of a splendid figure dressed like a great lord, richly clothed, sitting down among the living to join their meal, speaking with them, teaching them, and saying that he lived in the stone or mountain receiving the sacrifice. Elsewhere, the cider appeared as a tall, well-built man, dressed in dark clothing and carrying a gun. A man once thought to destroy his cider after receiving poor fishing luck, but stopped when the being appeared before him in human shape. Such tales do not present the cider as a mere object. The stone was a dwelling, a body or a fixed point through which a powerful being could show itself. Some traditions went further and said openly that the cider had once been human. In one northern story, a dead husband kept returning to trouble his widow at night. A shaman intervened, led the spirit away, and the next morning a new cider had appeared near the lake. In Russian Lapland, ciders were widely imagined as living much like the Lapps themselves. They kept reindeer and dogs, built dwellings, prepared sledges, married, celebrated, and even died. People said they could hear the barking of their dogs or the creaking of their sleds in the snow. Sometimes they appeared as birds, especially ravens rising from mountain clefts. Swedish Lapps, too, preserved a belief that a cider was once a bird which fell from the sky and turned to stone, so that in some stones the shape of a bird could still be traced. If such beings lived in groups and formed families, then the old sacred place begins to look less like a shrine to an abstract god, and more like a point of contact with a lineage of dead or hidden protectors. This also explains why the stone itself could be treated almost as a living body. A cider could move, follow its own path, and make it dangerous for anyone to cross that path. It could be hurt, angered, punished, or even killed. If it no longer served its worshippers or became a threat, people might strike it, chip pieces from it, shatter it, burn it, or throw it into water. Such acts were understood as the death of the cider. The relationship was personal and reciprocal, not passive. One negotiated with it, cared for it, feared it, and if necessary, destroyed it. There are also traces of a looser and perhaps older layer of belief. One report claims that some people were so easily satisfied in their choice of a divine helper that whatever first met the eye on leaving the tent in the morning might be treated as a god for that day, whether stone or stump. The next morning, another object might take its place. This idea stands apart from the inherited family sides and may point toward a more fluid habit of finding presence in striking or accidental things. Yet even here, the larger pattern remains the same. The sacred was encountered in objects that seemed suddenly to carry agency, attention, or power. Besides stones, the laps also had sacred posts or wooden sides. These could be stumps left standing in the ground or poles driven into it. Most had no detailed carved form, though in some places they appear to have been shaped roughly like human beings, complete with a head-like top. In Finnish Lapland, one method survived in memory. A living tree was cut off at a certain height, the top hollowed or shaped, and then covered with a slab of stone to prevent decay. Such posts were sometimes made near fishing waters in honour of the powers of the water. Among Swedish Lapps, sacrificial stumps stood 2 or 3 yards high and were roughly given a head and neck. These were often used only once, yet they were not destroyed afterward. Over time, many such wooden gods could gather in the same place. They seem to have been more temporary than the stone sides, perhaps serving when the spirit worshipped, belonged to a distant place and needed a local standing point. Even so, stone sides were always regarded as holier and more important than the wooden ones. The sacrifices made to these beings varied somewhat from region to region, but certain broad features remain consistent and very old. A valuable description from the 17th century shows how a reindeer sacrifice might be carried out. The animal was bound behind the tent and killed by a thrust to the heart. Its blood was gathered with care. Parts from the head and neck, together with the hooves, were taken to the sacred place. There, the worshipper removed his hat, bowed deeply, and smeared the seed with the blood and fat of the victim. Behind the stone, the horns were piled into great heaps, sometimes so large that they formed whole hornyards containing hundreds or even thousands. Small pieces of the meat from each quarter of the body were threaded onto birch twigs and hung before the horns. Sometimes the slaughter took place right at the holy place, and the meat was cooked and eaten there. The hide, the horns, and other remains were left in the sacred precinct rather than brought home again. Elsewhere, a sacrificial tree stood near the side, and the chosen animal was tied to it before being killed. The stone and the tree were both smeared with blood. Meat was cooked, strips were cut out and hung in a ring of flexible branches on the tree, and the people ate the rest together as a sacred meal. Anything left over stayed there with the hide and horns. In Norway, small parts from the ears and tail were first cut off and laid before the god as a preliminary taste. The animal was flayed so that the horns and hoofs remained attached to the skin. Small marked sticks were then set up near the seidi to represent ritual lights, an imitation of customs borrowed from neighbouring Christianity. The flesh was cooked at once, and both blood and rising fat were used to smear stones or objects placed near the god. Songs were sung throughout, and these songs themselves belonged to the act of offering. In Russian Lapland, the form could differ again. The ceremony began in the morning, with prayers spoken facing east. The skins of sacrificed reindeer were stuffed with birch twigs and set upright with heads turned toward the sunrise. Such feasts could be very large, involving many animals over several days. Everyone taking part had to cleanse themselves and wear clean garments. The food was treated as intensely holy, and even spilling it on one's clothing was unacceptable. The shaman stood apart during the rites, also turned eastward, while the animal forms faced the same direction. When the sacrifice ended, purification was repeated. Not only reindeer were offered. birds, game animals, dogs, fish, and in some accounts even more shocking offerings could be made. Some gifts were not killed in the usual way at all, but left alive in mountain clefts or on islands, handed over directly to the unseen beings. Fishing communities gave fish and fish parts to their stones. A fisherman might first go to the side, kiss it, promise the livers and entrails of the first catch, and then return later to fulfill that vow. In later periods, more modest gifts such as coins, brass rings, tobacco, or spirits were placed in hollows in the stones. The old system adapted, but the underlying logic remained recognizable. Help was requested, a promise was made, and repayment followed success. Seen in a wider perspective, these open-air stone cults seem to contain more than one kind of sacred being. Some were local family or household protectors, spirits bound to a kin group and inherited across generations. Others were larger powers tied to a district, a mountain, a village, or a whole fishing shore. Over time, the first sort tend in many cultures to move nearer the household, becoming portable family gods or domestic guardians. The second sort remain more public, closer to heroic ancestors, tutelary spirits, or powers rooted in the landscape itself. This transition becomes clearer when looking beyond the lapse to related northern peoples. Among the Samoyeds, family gods were no longer fixed in one landscape. They could be made of wood or unusual stones, dressed in reindeer skins or cloth, and kept by the household as its own sacred property. A father might own many such figures. They were wrapped rather than sewn into their garments, carried in special sledges when the camp moved, and treated with care throughout the year. When the family travelled, the sleigh carrying the gods went last in the line. The images were redressed regularly and fed through small sacrifices. At times, they were set outside the holy rear part of the tent on a temporary platform. At other times, they were brought into the sacred back section of the tent itself. During reindeer sacrifice, their mouths were smeared with blood and fat. And when such an image was first made, a shaman had to call a spirit into it, so that the figure would truly become a seat of power. Small weapons, tools, and animal spirit figures might stand beside these family gods, giving them both company and assistance. Among the northern Votiacs, family spirits were not left behind when a household moved. Like the Samoyeds, they could be carried from place to place in a special sled reserved for them alone. In other areas, especially among both Votiacs and Vogels, a more settled arrangement became common. The family spirits were kept inside the dwelling itself, usually near the sacred rear part of the tent, enclosed in a chest, a case, or some protected corner. Later, when ways of living changed and buildings became more varied, these beings might also be housed in barns or in lofts above the living space. The materials associated with them were diverse. Some were represented by wood, some by metal, others by hides or mixed substances. They were fed with food and drink just as the dead and the household gods of other related peoples were fed. Meat, fish, and strong drink could be offered to them, but they were also clothed with gifts of hides, scarves, and pieces of cloth. Their meals were not always tied to a strict calendar. They could be fed whenever the household judged it necessary, whether from gratitude, fear, trouble, or sudden need. Yet the social meaning of these family spirits can be seen most clearly not among the northern tent dwellers, but among the settled Votiacs. Their customs preserve the old structure with unusual clarity. In their world, the family spirit was not a vague, supernatural helper. It was closely bound to the chain of descent. The beings honoured in the family sanctuary were understood as protectors of prosperity. But beneath that role stood something older and deeper. They were the continuing presence of forefathers, the dead of one's own line, transformed into guardians of the household and remembered across generations. The place devoted to them was called the Koala, a word of ancient northern origin. Today, it might look like a simple outbuilding, but in older times it held a far greater importance. The Koala was usually a square timber structure, low and heavy, without a cellar and often without windows. It had no ceiling in the ordinary sense, and the floor was simply packed earth. In the middle stood a hearth bordered with stones, and above it hung or rested a large iron cauldron. Smoke escaped through an opening in the roof. The old doorway tended to face south. Sometimes the building was divided into two sections, or another structure stood behind it. The inner section was often considered holier than the rest, and in many places women were not allowed to enter that part. In more recent times, the Koala became little more than a storeroom for utensils and household things, but that was not its original purpose. Long before more developed houses appeared, the Koala had been the actual home of the Votiac family. That older reality never disappeared completely. In some districts, the Koala continued, especially in warm weather, to serve as a place where the family cooked and ate together. In such cases, it still resembled a living room. Benches ran along the walls. A table stood near the entrance. Cupboards for utensils might be placed near the door. Yet the most important thing in the whole building was not the hearth, the benches, or the storage space. It was the shelf fixed at about the height of a man, darkened by years of smoke, and above all the small closed case that rested there. This was the most sacred object in the building. Near it, the living believed, one could come nearest to the generations that had gone before. The Koala survived as a sanctuary even after architecture changed, and larger, more modern houses replaced it for daily use. Agriculture expanded, domestic life altered, but the old sacred building remained. It did so because the cult centered there could not simply be abandoned. The rules surrounding it show plainly that it was not a place for the village at large, nor even for all neighbours. It belonged to a particular family line. One family did not enter another family's sanctuary in order to perform sacrifice there. Even a foster son raised in the household but belonging by blood to another line had to go to the Koala of his own people when the time for sacrifice came, even if that sanctuary stood in another village. A married woman also remained marked by her original family connection. In the early part of her married life, if sickness or trouble came, she might still need to return to the sanctuary of her birth family and make offerings there. In this system, marriage could move a woman into another household, but kinship and sacred descent were not erased so easily. This reveals the real force of the Koala cult. It acted as a tie between all members of the same family, across distance, across generations, and even across the boundary between living and dead. Every Votiac was expected to know the line from which he came. Family names preserved this memory, even when their meanings were no longer understood. These names allowed kinsmen to recognize each other in distant places. The same can be said of the family mark placed on property, often based on the image of some object such as a foot, a tool, or a sign inherited from older usage. The eldest son kept the father's mark because he remained in the paternal home. Younger sons had to modify it slightly when they founded separate households. In this way, both the family name and the property mark preserved visible traces of descent. They were not mere labels. They were social signs tied to the same inherited sacred order that centered in the Koala. The eldest son inherited more than land and tools. He inherited the sanctuary, the family mark, and the duty of acting as guardian of the Koala. If there was no son, another close male relative assumed the role. That guardian kept the hearth, the sacred shelf, and the rites of sacrifice. Even when sons built homes of their own, they did not always establish a new sanctuary at once. many continued for a long time to worship in the father's koala, or even in the grandfather's if the line required it. This means that the original family unit must once have been larger than the later isolated household. Several smaller families remained bound to the same old sanctuary, obeying one sacred center. For this reason, there could be several levels of koala within the same social world. A household might maintain what was called the little koala, while at the same time participating in a greater one associated with the founding line of the village. If the village itself had grown from a single family, then one common great koala might serve all who belonged to that line. In villages formed later from settlers of different origins, each major family group had its own great koala. The little koala often remained in ordinary use as storehouse or kitchen, but the great koala, when shared by a whole village lineage, gradually became more like a temple. It could stand apart in its own enclosure and take on a purely sacred significance. In some places, women were not allowed inside it at all. Under these conditions, the old family sanctuary had developed into something larger, but without losing its roots in kinship. The centre of all this remained the sacrifice shelf. There, usually in the left rear corner, offerings were placed on holy days. Beneath or near it stood the small case associated with the family protector, called Vorsud, the guardian of luck and prosperity. In modern times, this case is often empty. Yet it is difficult to believe that such an object, protected with awe and surrounded by restrictions, was always empty. Older accounts mention coins, bird bones, feathers, bits of fur, wool, and other things found within it. These look more like offerings than like the spirit itself. The deeper explanation is more persuasive. Among related peoples, cases and chests, kept in the sacred rear part of the house, still contain actual spirit images. The Votiac case must once have served a similar purpose, even if no such figures survived into recent times. Memory of them lingered. The case was too important, too feared, and too central to have been only a box for scraps. It is likely that the beings once placed in these cases were small human-like figures, perhaps wooden, perhaps clothed, perhaps no larger than the case itself allowed. Similar figures were made in other settings, especially during illness, when a doll could be used to draw harm away from a sufferer. Among neighbouring peoples, household spirits were also represented by rough carved figures, dressed and housed like living beings. The Votiacs may no longer have openly preserved such images, yet the sacred shelf remained where later Christian images could be placed, as if the old logic of a dwelling place for protection had simply taken on a different outward form. Green twigs laid beneath the case formed another essential element of the sanctuary. In summer, birch twigs were used. At leafless times of year, twigs from evergreen trees took their place. This custom was extremely ancient. Similar practices were known among the Lapps, who placed seasonally appropriate greenery under their sacred objects. In the Votiac world, these twigs remained important even after the older images had vanished. In some places, they were almost all that visibly remained of the original sanctuary. Yet, they were handled with the same reverence as the case itself. Only the priest or guardian could remove the old ones and replace them with fresh branches. Some outside observers once imagined that the twigs themselves were the object of worship, but that is unlikely. Their original role was secondary. They formed a living bed, a fresh support, a proper place for the spirit dwelling above them. A new koala could not simply be built and used like any other outbuilding. It had to be inaugurated through solemn rites. These ceremonies often took place in summer and resembled a wedding in surprising ways. The man founding the new sanctuary invited a few guests, men and women together, and they first went to the old family sanctuary, bringing bread and drink. There they feasted, sang, and visited neighbours much as participants would at a marriage celebration. At the proper moment, the new master took ashes from the hearth of the old koala, wrapped them in clean cloth, and declared that he was taking the smaller portion while leaving the greater behind. Those ashes were then carried to the new building and placed on its shelf. In some versions, a chip from the old hanging pot support was taken as well. The message is unmistakable. The new sanctuary was not created from nothing. Its life was drawn from the old one. Fire, ashes, wood, and sacred continuity passed from the ancestral hearth into the new household. The ceremonial language used at this moment shows the spirit being addressed directly. The guardian told the being that he had brought it with reverence to a new place and asked it not to be angry, but to hear the prayers offered there from now on. Music accompanied the transfer, and in some places the procession looked so much like a wedding journey that the spirit itself seemed to be carried like a bride or a bridegroom into the new home. Women dressed as for marriage, bells rang, and the feast was explicitly spoken of as a wedding. This does not mean the rite was playful. Rather, it treated the founding of a new household as a true social birth, requiring the presence and blessing of the ancestral protector, just as marriage required the joining of two lines. Older traces suggest that before ashes alone were transferred, the actual spirit image or part of the contents of the old case may once have been given to the departing son. A son who received no share in this sacred inheritance suffered a serious loss. In fact, some traditions say that if a father refused to give the family protector to a son founding a new household, the son might resort to taking it by stealth. The wording spoken at the moment of taking determined whether the older or greater spiritual right passed to him. Such details show that this was not a minor household custom. It was a contested, inherited, and powerful transfer of sacred legitimacy. Once established, a koala had to remain in worship. Sacrifice in a consecrated sanctuary could not be broken off without danger. Neglect invited disaster, madness, loss of property, or other ruin. If the building had to be moved, the timbers were taken apart and rebuilt in the same order. The hearthstones, ashes, and sacred case were carried to the new site with ceremony. Stories tell of the family spirit groaning beneath a barn built over the remains of a destroyed sanctuary until a new koala was erected, and the sacred objects restored to their proper place. Such tales reveal how strongly the building, the hearth, and the spirit were bound together. Although the family protector was often spoken of in the singular, older custom clearly points to more than one spirit. Families could distribute the sacred force among descendants, and legends describe several figures emerging from one sanctuary, including young males and a female. This plurality fits the ancestral character of the cult. The sanctuary held not just a single abstract guardian, but a line of presences rooted in the family itself. Even after founding a new sanctuary, a man did not entirely abandon the older one. He still visited the little koala of his own yard, the great koala of his village line, and sometimes an even older mother sanctuary from which the village itself had once branched off. Through this layered pattern, the Votiac remained linked to the immediate household, the wider village lineage, and the remembered ancestral origin beyond both. Some remote ruined koalas still survived in abandoned places, visited only in times of severe illness or great need. These were thought to be the furthest old homes still held in memory, the outermost sanctuaries from which the living line had once begun. On the regular sacred days of the year, the Votiacs made offerings in both the lesser family sanctuary and the greater one connected to the wider kin group. In some cases, they also sent representatives to the older ancestral sanctuary in the mother village. The rituals in these different places followed almost the same pattern, though each district preserved its own small variations. the order could change. In one village, the sacrifice began in the lesser sanctuary and moved afterward to the greater one, while elsewhere, the larger sanctuary came first. Some ceremonies took place late in the evening, others in daylight. In certain places, the observance lasted only a short time, while in others it stretched over 2 or 3 days, turning the offering into a full communal festival, rather than a single act of prayer. Older descriptions show that these rites once involved blood sacrifice much more regularly than they do now. One early account describes a young calf being offered near the sacred greenery that represented the family protector. The animal was killed inside the sanctuary, and its ears were placed on the shelf where the green branches lay. Another report gives an Easter ceremony in which both men and women took part after purifying themselves in the bathhouse. Each person brought something necessary for the sacrifice. When the meat was ready, the officiating elder set aside portions from every dish, along with drink, and laid them opposite the doorway. Above this place, fresh branches had already been set on the shelf, and there the first sacred morsels were placed. Holding food and drink in his hands, the priest asked the family protector for the things people most desired from life: health, happiness, children, cattle, honey, and bread. A fuller 19th century account shows the same logic in more detail. The guests arrived carrying bread, cakes, eggs, spirits, and beer. The sacrificial animal was led into the centre of the sanctuary and placed before the sacred corner. Beside it, they arranged loaves and eggs brought by the participants. If many loaves had been offered, a few whole ones were chosen, while only pieces were cut from the others and added to the main offering. While one man prayed over the animal, another poured water upon it. After the prayer, the victim was killed and its blood collected in a vessel. The skin was removed, the entrails cleaned, and the refuse buried in a pit. The body was cut so that portions could be taken from every important part, including the head, breast, and legs. The meat was boiled and the blood was added to the cooking. Once the food was ready, those present began to taste the feast. But before eating fully, they sacrificed portions of food and drink into the fire again and again. Even the bones were gathered carefully and either burned or buried. The prayer asked the protecting power of the sanctuary to guard the family, increase the herds, and bless the growth of the fields. In the southern and eastern districts, women were often excluded from the central part of these rites. Sometimes they remained outside with the children while the men performed the offering inside. Yet this was not the oldest pattern. In the northern regions, where older forms often survived more clearly, women were still present during family sacrifices, and in some places they even had their own appointed representative at the festival. Then the ritual took on a more balanced shape. A male and female pair acted as ceremonial host and hostess, each taking a different place in the sanctuary. Men sat to one side of the hearth, women to the other. The leading man remained covered while serving in his role. When the sacrifice ended, music and singing could continue, and the officiating elder might improvise special songs for the occasion. This combination of solemn prayer and shared festivity reveals that the rite was never only about fear. It was also about continuity, hospitality, and the public life of the family. In later times, blood sacrifice became less common at the regular annual festivals. It was still considered necessary for special emergencies, but for the ordinary seasonal rites, bread or porridge often replaced animal offerings. Even then, however, the old form remained visible. The sacrificial fire still had to be lit, as though memory of the older practice could not be allowed to vanish entirely. In many places, at least once a year, a blood offering still had to be made from goods provided by the group. The ritual could be simplified, but not completely emptied of its older force. At every sacrifice, one part of the offering was placed on the sacred shelf and another was given to the fire. This double form is one of the most striking features of the Koala rite. Bread was set on a white cloth spread over the shelf in the sacred corner. Sometimes the special loaf was made by the guardian's wife from spring grain, while the other families contributed smaller pieces of bread to join it. Butter, honey, and drink might also be placed there. If a blood sacrifice was performed, a little porridge mixed with meat, or the most valued organs of the animal cooked in separate pans, could be set upon the shelf as the share belonging to the unseen power of the place. In many districts, these offerings remained on the shelf only while the prayer was being spoken. Yet some customs clearly suggest that earlier they stayed there much longer. In one area, the head of a sacrificial duck might remain for 2 or 3 days before the officiating man finally consumed it. At Easter, a cake or a cup of water could stand there through the night, or even for an entire week before members of the family ate it. Women, however, usually did not eat the food that had rested on the sacred shelf. This raises an important question. Why was one part of the offering laid before the family protector and another thrown into the flames? The two forms may preserve different historical layers. The act of laying food upon the shelf appears to be older, tied directly to the dwelling place of the family spirit. Burning portions in the fire may be later, perhaps influenced by wider sacrificial patterns. The old northern evidence suggests that fire sacrifice was not equally central everywhere in the earlier Finno-Ugric world. In the Votiac sanctuary, the shelf still points back to a time when the family protector was fed directly in its own place, as one might feed a dead ancestor or an unseen guest. Besides food, the family spirit also received gifts, meant to remain with it. In earlier times, the sanctuary accumulated objects that served as clothing, adornment, and sacred property. Old cases are said to have contained skins, feathers, coins, and various other offerings. In the past, such treasures seem to have been much richer than in later times. So much so that some of the greater sanctuaries became real storehouses of sacred goods. Because of this, they had to be kept secure and guarded with care. The family spirit was not only fed, it was clothed, furnished, and enriched like a continuing member of the household. Money also became part of this sacred economy. After the feast, each participant contributed a coin, either dropping it into a box or pressing it into the ritual bread held by the guardian. Sometimes the money was brought already fixed to the loaf. This shared collection did not belong to ordinary household use. It could be spent only on sacred needs, repairing the sanctuary, buying ritual equipment, or securing future sacrificial animals. Through these contributions, every participant renewed his material bond to the sanctuary and to the line of ancestors represented there. Not all sacrifices followed the regular calendar. Some were held only when misfortune forced the family to act. If illness or trouble was judged by a sorcerer to have come from the offended spirits of the sanctuary, then a special offering had to be vowed. The actual victim might not be killed at once. First, a promise was made. If poverty prevented immediate fulfillment, the vow could be renewed later, but it could never be forgotten or postponed forever. To leave such a promise hanging was dangerous. The spirit had heard, and it would remember. Marriage was one of the moments when such a vow became especially necessary. Before a daughter left the house, the father might lead her around the hearth and promise an ox, calf, or other animal to the family protector. In some places, the sacrifice itself followed months later, when the married daughter returned with a bird for offering in the greater sanctuary of her birth family. The ritual then made her status plain. She no longer belonged fully to the old household. She could not pass entirely into the new one until she had offered due honour to the protecting spirits of her native home. Only after this was she fully free to sacrifice in the sanctuary of her husband's family. If later sickness or trouble struck, she might still be told to return to the old family protector, because some part of her still remained tied to the place from which she had come. This close relation between the family protector and the dead becomes even more obvious when the rituals of the Koala are compared with memorial feasts for deceased relatives. The same kinds of requests are made to both. In times of illness, in fear of loss, in hopes for children, cattle, and prosperity, the family may turn to the sanctuary spirit and to the dead of the line almost in the same breath. In some prayers, both are named together. The calendar strengthens the connection as well. The annual festivals of the sanctuary often fall very near the memorial observances for the dead. That is unlikely to be accidental. It suggests that the Koala rite preserves an older form of ancestor remembrance, one in which larger sacrificial animals once played the role that poultry later played at more domestic memorial feasts. Over time, the two traditions changed and moved apart, but both survived side by side. Among other Finno-Ugric peoples, this kind of cult did not remain as fully developed as it did among the Votiacs, though traces survived in many places. The old family building itself often disappeared, but the sacred corner remained. Among the Ceremis, for example, the back part of the house could still contain a darkened case regarded as the dwelling of the house spirit. Even when the case was gone, the shelf remained holy. Birch leaves, though now dry and seldom renewed, still marked the place as special. No stranger was allowed near it. Women were kept away from it. Children feared it. To protect the sacred rear section, some houses had once been divided by a partition, and in certain districts that inner part was still spoken of as a smaller hidden room within the larger one. Adult men alone entered it freely. There, in older times, weapons, hunting gear, and the objects needed for sacrifice had been kept. If no old house remained, the sacred case might be stored in another protected building. But the idea of a dwelling place for the family spirit continued. The spirit of this inner household place could also appear in dreams when it wanted an offering. A black sheep is said to have been its older due, though later it was usually given only smaller victims such as hens and ducks, especially in cases of eye disease or personal trouble. At first, the vow might be fulfilled only with meal, honey, cakes, and small offerings on the sacred shelf. The full sacrifice followed later. The household then baked special bread from the vowed ingredients and consumed the meal together inside the old sacred space. Only members of the family could share in it. Before the meal began, pieces were placed on the shelf while the head of the family asked forgiveness for any offense, known or unknown, committed by the household. He begged the spirit to protect both people and home. In some districts, a fixed autumn sacrifice was still made, with bones buried beneath the building itself and portions from every part of the victim placed on the shelf. The same structure seen among the Votiacs appears here as well. After marriage, a woman might still need to return to the sacred place of her birth family if illness or misfortune suggested that the old spirits had been offended. Younger family branches remain dependent on the older one. There are even early reports of a rough wooden doll or figure associated with the household spirit, kept in a case or placed upon the table at important domestic ceremonies such as weddings. Even if such images later vanished, the memory of a visible family being remained. Something similar once seems to have existed among the Mordvins and even among the Baltic Finns. Among Estonians, later customs preserve especially striking echoes. There, a sacred case connected with a household protector was kept hidden in the loft or storehouse and brought out only at certain times. It received offerings through the year whenever bread was baked, beer brewed, cattle carved, sheep shorn, or cloth woven. At times of sickness, it had to be remembered at once. If neglected, it could cause misfortune. In some traditions, the case even contained a little image. Not only families, but entire villages seem once to have had such sacred containers, suggesting again the same old distinction between the smaller domestic line and the wider community of descent. There are no equally clear reports from the Finns themselves, but social customs in Karelia hint at a similar older structure. Large and small family groupings existed side by side, and leadership in the broader family could pass down through a senior male line. The married woman, meanwhile, retained a sense of separateness from her husband's kin, which fits well with a society where ancestor worship and family sanctuaries defined belonging in a very strict way.